I once had a client whose husband threw a casserole dish at her because she didn't put enough salt in it. But let me tell you, what you're about to hear, it's worse, much worse. This isn't just a story about marriage, it's about control, about a man who wore the perfect mask in public and the woman he thought he'd broken behind closed doors. But she had a secret and inheritance. Yes, but more than that, a fire in her that he never saw coming. One bowl of hot soup changed everything. What started as humiliation in a crowded restaurant became the beginning of a quiet revolution. And trust me, honey, this isn't some cautionary tale. This is a reckoning. If you've ever wondered what it looks like when a woman claws her way back from betrayal with grace, grit, and a touch of revenge, you're about to find out. Let's begin. I never thought a bowl of hot soup could unravel a marriage. But then again, I never thought I'd marry a man like Grant Halston. We were seated in the back corner of Redbird Tavern, a little upscale place tucked away in the historic part of Rosewood, Virginia. The kind of place with real linen napkins and waiters who remember your wine preference from 6 months ago. Grant liked it because the lighting was low, the tables were spaced far apart, and people whispered more than they talked. Privacy. That's what he said. But now, I wonder if he just liked the idea of being seen without being heard. I was wearing a pale blue blouse, soft silk, the kind you save for anniversary dinners. Though this wasn't an anniversary, just another Tuesday night, Grant insisted on marking with a meal out, right after I told him I wasn't signing the financial documents he'd left on the kitchen table that morning. I hadn't even opened them yet. I didn't need to. I already knew what they were. Grant was always dressing up control as long-term planning. The waiter brought out our food, his usual steak, medium rare, and a bowl of butternut squash soup for me. I didn't have much of an appetite, but I needed something warm. My nerves had been on edge all day. Grant was already swirling his glass of Merlot when he leaned in and said, "I spoke to Tom Bradbury this morning. He's got a contact at the foundation. They're still open to our investment proposal." I didn't answer right away. I sipped the soup. It was too hot, sharp on the tongue, but better than speaking too soon. "I thought we already agreed not to touch the trust," I said, gently setting the spoon down. He smiled. That tight, thin-lipped smile he used when he was trying to mask irritation. That trust could do more good in 3 years under our guidance than it ever will sitting in accounts collecting dust. "It's not collecting dust," I said, my voice low. "It's funding the literacy programs Grant cared about. The women's shelter. You know that. She's gone, Helen." His voice sharpened. "It's time we stop acting like we owe her anything." I looked at him across the table, at his pressed collar and gold cufflinks, and for a split second, I saw a stranger. I think that's what frightened me most. Not that he had changed, but that maybe I'd never really seen him clearly. "She didn't leave it to us," I said carefully. "She left it to me." Grant's smile faded completely then. He leaned back, crossing one leg over the other, swirling the wine again like he needed something to do with his hands. "We've been married 17 years. What's yours is mine. You know that." "No," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "That's not how it works. Not with this." Grant structured it specifically. She was protecting something. He stared at me for a long time. The clinking of silverware and hushed conversations around us made the silence louder. Then, slowly, he set his wine glass down and reached for his cloth napkin. "You're making a mistake, Helen," he said. "A big one. And frankly, I'm losing patience with your sentimentality." Then it happened. One moment, he was seated calmly. The next, the bowl of steaming soup was in his hand. He flicked his wrist deliberate, surgical, and the contents flew across the table in a scalding wave. It hit me across the chest and neck, stinging instantly. I gasped, the heat biting into my skin, and dropped the spoon with a clatter. The restaurant fell silent. All I could hear was the faint hum of the air vents and the blood pounding in my ears. Grant didn't move. He didn't apologize. He didn't even flinch. He calmly wiped his fingers on his napkin like nothing had happened. "See?" he said, his voice low and even. "This is what happens when you make things difficult." I was shaking, not just from the pain, but from the realization that this man, my husband, was no longer someone I could reason with. If he ever had been, A server rushed over with a stack of napkins and wide, horrified eyes. "Ma'am, are you all right? Should I call someone?" Grant put on his warmest, most professional smile. "She's fine," he said. "Just got a little too emotional. It's been a stressful few months." I looked at the server, then at Grant, and suddenly everything inside me went cold. "No," I said, pushing my chair back slowly. "Call the police." The look on Grant's face, then shock, pure and naked, told me everything I needed to know. He hadn't expected that. He'd expected tears, a quiet apology, maybe a ride home in silence, but not this, not resistance. I think we need to go outside," he stammered. "No," I said again, louder this time. "We're done." I left the soup-soaked napkins on the table and walked out into the night, the cold air slicing through my wet blouse. The burn on my chest throbbed, and I could feel the silk clinging to my skin like second-degree betrayal. But I kept walking. I didn't know where I was going, only that I wasn't going back. Not to that table, not to that house, not to that life. Because something inside me had snapped like a curtain being pulled back to reveal the truth. And once you see the truth, you can't unsee it. You can't sit quietly and pretend everything is fine. Not anymore. Not ever again. The police came quickly that night. 2 officers, a young woman who looked barely old enough to drive, and a man with tired eyes and a paunch under his belt stood beside me in the parking lot as I explained what had happened. I was shaking, both from the cold and from something deeper, something like rage or grief, or maybe both, twisted together so tightly. I couldn't tell one from the other. I'd always imagined that if Grant ever crossed a line, I'd know what to do, that I'd be brave, that I'd take action. But the truth was, I stood there trembling, soup still dripping down my blouse, telling the officers in a hoarse voice, "He did it on purpose. He meant to hurt me." The male officer squinted toward the restaurant. "Your husband's still inside?" "He's not my husband anymore," I whispered, not fully meaning to say it out loud. The words just came out. They went in to speak with him. I stood alone by the curb, clutching my purse like a lifeline, while the cold crept under my skin and the burn on my neck continued to sting. The soup hadn't blistered, thank God, but it had left a red patch across my collarbone. And it wasn't just the pain, it was the humiliation, the sudden understanding that all the quiet digs and manipulations I tolerated over the years had escalated into this. And he hadn't even raised his voice. That scared me more than anything. The officers came back 10 minutes later. The female one, Officer Jarvis, looked at me with sympathy. "He claims it was an accident. Says he knocked over the bowl when reaching for your wine glass. There's no clear video angle inside. Restaurant says the back corner camera was out." Of course it was. Grant probably chose that table on purpose. Jarvis looked down at her notepad. "We can file an incident report tonight, and you can choose to pursue charges later. You'll need to take photos of the burn. Might be worth getting checked at urgent care." I nodded. My voice felt like it had been buried somewhere inside me. "I managed to get out. I'll file the report." When they handed me the clipboard, my hands were shaking so badly, I had to steady it against my thigh to write. But I signed it. That's when something shifted. It was the first time in years I had made a decision without checking Grant's reaction. I didn't need his permission anymore. I was done asking. I went to my friend Maggie's house that night. She lived on the other side of Rosewood, in a cozy craftsman-style home with string lights on her porch and a pot of lavender on the kitchen counter that always made the air smell like calm. She answered the door in pajamas, eyes wide when she saw the mess I was in. "I don't know what to say," she whispered after I told her everything. "I think I've been waiting for a moment," I said, wiping the dried soup from my chin. Something so undeniable that even couldn't explain it away. "And that was it?" she asked gently. "That was it." She made me tea, tucked me into the guest room, and left me with a warm towel and a clean t-shirt to sleep in. I didn't sleep much, though. My skin was still tender, but that wasn't what kept me up. It was the questions, the things I didn't want to admit. How long had I known this marriage was wrong? How many times had I told myself I was overreacting? How many moments had I swallowed my truth just to keep the peace? I stared at the ceiling in the dark and thought about the trust. Gran's legacy. She'd left it in my name for a reason, and I was starting to understand why. Grant had always talked like he was the one holding everything together. The investments, the planning, the image. But Grant had seen something in me, something I'd let go quiet over the years. I fell asleep just before dawn, woke a few hours later to the sound of birds chirping outside the window. I sat up slowly. Every part of me ached like I'd been in a wreck. Maggie greeted me with a soft smile and a mug of coffee. He came by last night. I froze. I didn't let him in. Told him you were safe, and that if he came back, I'd call the police again. He didn't like that. No, I murmured. He wouldn't. She hesitated before adding, he left this for you. She handed me a small white envelope, my name on the front, written in Grant's immaculate block letters. I didn't open it right away, just held it in my lap, staring at it like it might explode. Finally, I slid a finger under the flap and unfolded the single sheet inside. Helen, we both said things last night we didn't mean. I know this has been a stressful time for you. I forgive you for involving the police. We can fix this, but not if you keep letting emotion cloud your judgment. Think about what you're doing. That trust isn't just a sentimental relic, it could be the future for both of us. Let's meet and talk. Privately, he forgave me. I laughed out loud. A raw, bitter sound I barely recognized as mine. That's when the second shift happened. First was the fear cracking. This was something else. A slow burning ember of anger, glowing hotter by the second. He wasn't sorry. He wasn't scared. He thought he still had the upper hand. That I'd come crawling back, like I always had. But not this time. This time, I had something he didn't understand. I had Gran's records, her handwritten journals, notes from her meetings, letters from the women she'd helped. The trust wasn't just money, it was history. It was protection. It was purpose. And if Grant thought he could bully me into handing that over with a bowl of soup and a thinly veiled threat, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. I didn't respond to Grant's letter. I didn't need to. Instead, I went home that afternoon while I knew he'd be at work. The house still smelled like the rosemary candles I used to light. In the evenings, little rituals I'd clung to in order to feel like things were normal. The kitchen was spotless, as always. Grant couldn't stand a mess, but I saw it now for what it was: sterility, not order. A home scrubbed so clean, it left no room for warmth. I went straight to the bedroom and began packing. Not just an overnight bag this time. I moved with a kind of quiet fury, folding clothes, tucking away essentials, slipping photo albums and Gran's letters into my suitcase. I left the wedding photos right where they were, let him dust them if he missed them so much. In the back of the closet, behind a box of Christmas decorations, I found Gran's leather portfolio. I hadn't looked through it since the funeral. Not properly. Inside were more than just estate documents. There were sketches, floor plans, names, dates, handwritten lists in her looping script. There was a letter, too, one I hadn't seen before. Dearest Helen, if you're reading this, something has changed. Maybe you've reached the fork in the road I always knew would come. This trust, this inheritance, it was never just about money. It was a lifeline, not just for you, but for the women who came before you, and those still to come. You'll know what to do when the time is right. Trust yourself, sweetheart. The legacy is yours to protect and to grow. Love, always, Gran. I sat on the floor, tears welling in my eyes. She'd known. Long before I did, she'd seen the signs. That evening, I met with Michael, Gran's old attorney. He'd handled her estate, her charitable work, and everything else that had been tucked away from Grant's reach. We met in a quiet law office in downtown Franklin Ridge, just 2 miles from where Gran's historic building still stood untouched, waiting. Are you sure you're ready for this? Michael asked, setting the leather folder on the table between us. I'm done being afraid of him, I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected. He tried to burn away my dignity with a bowl of soup. Instead, he lit something in me I didn't know I still had. Michael gave me a look of quiet approval. Then, Let's talk options. It took hours. But by the time I left, we had a plan in motion. I would assume full stewardship of the properties Gran had left: the old carriage house, the row of Queen Anne's off Maple Street, and the Victorian mansion she used for community retreats decades ago. Most people thought they were investment properties. They had no idea what those buildings had once been and what they could become again. The next morning, Grant was waiting outside Maggie's house. I opened the door and stepped onto the porch before he could ring the bell. "You need to leave." He smirked, all smooth charm with an undercurrent of menace. "Come on, Helen. This is getting out of hand. You're hiding out, like some runaway wife. You embarrassed me. You called the police. You threw hot soup in my face." He didn't even flinch. It was an accident. "And now you're overreacting. We need to talk. Face to face." "We're doing that now," I said. "And I'm telling you, it's over. I'm moving forward. Without you." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You really think you can handle all that property on your own? You don't have the experience, Helen. I've been the one holding the finances together while you played with paint swatches and antique tile." I smiled, just slightly. "Funny. I've been getting calls from clients all week. You didn't shut down my business, Grant. You reminded people who I am." He narrowed his eyes. "You're making a mistake." "No," I said, stepping back into the doorway. "I made one when I married you. But now I'm fixing it." And then I shut the door in his face. For the first time in years, I didn't feel scared afterward. Later that week, I stood on the porch of the Victorian mansion on Hawthorne Avenue. The paint was peeling, the porch creaked, and the garden had been overtaken by wild ivy, but it still felt like home. Gran had hosted retreats here in the 80s and early 90s, helping women who were escaping domestic abuse before there were proper shelters in town. I remembered playing in the rose garden as a child, while she sat on the porch talking with women who cried into cups of tea. I walked through the empty rooms, already seeing what they could become. The grand parlor would be a welcome center. The upstairs bedrooms could be healing spaces, offices, quiet rooms. I imagined survivors painting murals in the hallway, their stories etched into the walls in soft colors and strong lines. I wasn't just reclaiming Gran's legacy. I was building something new. That night, Maggie and I toasted with a glass of cheap wine on the front steps. "You know he's not going to give up," she said. "Let him try," I replied, looking out at the street where the sun was dipping below the old elms. "I've got something better than fear now." "What's that?" "A mission." Maggie raised her glass. "To purpose." We clinked our glasses together, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. The news about the property purchase hit town gossip circles. Before I had a chance to even change the locks. A woman buying up half of Hawthorne Avenue? And not just any woman, but Helen Shaw, the one whose husband had thrown soup at her in a restaurant like some deranged toddler. People whispered in the grocery aisles, in the pews at church, at the farmers' market stalls on Saturday mornings. Most didn't speak to me directly, but I could feel it, the shift in energy, the uncertainty. Some rooted for me quietly. Others waited for me to fail. I ignored them all, because I had work to do. The first call I made was to Sophia Lance, a local architect with a reputation for caring more about community than commissions. We met in the mansion's dusty kitchen, standing in a beam of morning light that cut through the grime. "I used to walk by this house every day," Sophia said, tracing her hand along the old wooden trim. "Always thought it looked like it was waiting for something." "It was," I said, my voice catching. "It was waiting for us." We spent 3 hours walking the property. I told her what Gran had done here, about the women who'd found refuge behind these walls, about the letters, the old photographs, the vision. She listened, really listened. When I finished, she nodded. "You don't want to flip this," she said. "No, you want to restore it to what it was, and maybe something more." "Exactly. I'm in." We shook hands right there in the overgrown backyard, surrounded by ivy and roses and broken dreams ready to be rebuilt. Word traveled quickly. A few former clients reached out to ask if I was still taking design work. I said yes, with one condition. I'd only take projects that could help fund the new center. My waiting list filled up in 2 weeks. Then came the email that made me stop mid-coffee sip. We saw what happened. We believe in what you're building. Let us know how we can help. It was signed by Dr. Melissa Walsh, head of the ER at Franklin General Hospital, a woman I barely knew beyond community fundraisers and the occasional brush of shoulders at charity events. I wrote back the same day. The next afternoon, she showed up at the mansion with a black notebook, a fresh cup of coffee, and fire in her eyes. I've worked in medicine for 20 years, she said. You wouldn't believe how many women come in with injuries they can't explain how many times the signs are there, and no one wants to see them. But I see them, and I'm done pretending it's not systemic. I poured her coffee, nodding slowly. I want this to be a place where we don't just treat bruises, Helen, she continued. We treat trauma. We treat silence. And we teach women to stop apologizing for surviving. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. Then let's build that place. We started assembling a team. Maggie took on operations. She had a sharp eye for details and didn't mind chasing down permits or getting into polite shouting matches at City Hall. Sophia worked on the building design. Melissa brought in 2 counselors she trusted from the hospital, both women with years of experience in trauma recovery. I brought in Morgan. Morgan had been my assistant at the design firm before I stepped back after the incident. She was 27, whip-smart, unflinchingly loyal, and had once told a real estate developer to stuff his granite countertops when he tried to lowball our bid. I trusted her. And more than that, I needed her energy. Are you sure? She asked, wide-eyed, after I told her what we were doing. Absolutely. I mean, this is big, Helen. This isn't picking out wallpaper for some banker's wine cellar. I know. That's exactly why it matters. She didn't hesitate after that. It felt like we were building a fortress, but instead of bricks and mortar, we were using stories, purpose, and the truth. No one wanted to speak out loud. Every woman on that team had either lived through abuse, helped someone who had, or been forced to reckon with the system's failures. The momentum was building. So naturally, that's when Grant struck back. It came in the form of a manila envelope delivered to my temporary apartment documents from his attorney claiming partial interest in the Victorian property and the adjoining carriage house. The justification? Shared marital investment potential. My stomach dropped, the audacity of it. He hadn't lifted a finger to help Gran while she was alive. He'd rolled his eyes at every historical preservation grant application I'd ever talked about over dinner. And now he wanted a slice? Michael reviewed the paperwork and leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply. This is a scare tactic, he said. He doesn't have a legal leg to stand on, not with how your grandmother structured the trust. But it's a warning shot. Then I want to fire back. You sure you're ready for that? I met his eyes, steady and calm. He threw soup in my face in front of 20 people. I'm not interested in playing nice anymore. Michael smiled, just a little. Then let's tighten the perimeter. We moved fast, fortifying the trust, updating beneficiary clauses, restructuring ownership of the design firm. I made sure every aspect of the center was shielded. And still, he pushed. He started calling former clients, trying to undercut my work. A few backed out, but most didn't. Some even forwarded me the voicemails he left, the ones where his voice dipped into that poisonous whisper. I knew too well, but the worst part wasn't the calls or the legal threats. It was the look on his face when we ran into each other at the hardware store. I was picking out tile samples for the counseling rooms, soft blues, and warm grays, when I felt him behind me. Gran's house, he said, as if testing the taste of it. It was always too much house for you. I turned slowly. Too much for me, or too much for you to control. He smiled. You think this whole savior project's going to heal you? I think it already is. He stepped closer, his cologne too familiar, too sharp. You're not going to win, Helen. I already did, I said, and walked away, leaving him standing in the middle of the tile aisle, surrounded by color samples he would never understand. That night, back at the mansion, I stood in the garden, staring at the twisted remains of Gran's rose trellis. It was cracked, splintered from years of neglect. I knelt down, brushed the dirt off the base, and saw something that stopped me cold. Tiny red buds, new life, stubborn and defiant, growing anyway. The next morning, I was still thinking about those rosebuds when Morgan burst into the mansion with 2 coffees and a look that meant something had gone wrong. "We have a problem," she said, handing me the cup like it was a shield. "The zoning board meeting got pushed up. They're reviewing our development permits today, not next week." I blinked. Today? That's not possible. We were told we had 7 more days. Well, apparently someone with connections on the board submitted a formal objection citing historic preservation violations. My stomach turned. "Grant." Morgan nodded. "Almost certainly. He's trying to kill this project before it even starts." We scrambled. Melissa called in a favor with her friend on the city council to buy us a little time during the hearing. Sophia printed the updated site plans and blueprints, making sure every measurement was documented to the inch. And I pulled out Grant's original preservation files, worn, yellowed, but still binding. By the time we walked into the municipal building that afternoon, I felt like I'd aged 5 years in 5 hours. The room was packed. Reporters, local business owners, and even a few old neighbors who hadn't said a word to me since the soup incident. I could feel their eyes on me as I walked to the front, with Sophia, Morgan, and Melissa behind me. We waded through 3 other zoning disputes: a fence height argument, a drainage issue, a noise complaint about a bar down on Willow Street. Each felt like static in my head, buzzing just under the surface of my skin. Finally, they called our case. Sophia began the presentation. She walked them through the updated floor plans, showing how the main house would remain intact, how the additions would blend with the original structure, and how we'd consulted with a preservation specialist at the university. Morgan followed with economic data, job creation, local supply sourcing, revitalization impact. Then it was my turn. I stepped forward with the file in my hands, fingers trembling just slightly. "This isn't just about a building," I began, my voice low but clear. "It's about a legacy. My grandmother used this house to shelter women escaping abuse, quietly, without fanfare. And now, we're asking for permission to continue that work publicly, sustainably, and with the community's involvement." I opened the file and passed copies of Grant's original preservation petition to the board members. She saved this house from demolition once, and in doing so, she saved lives. We're not tearing anything down. We're building on what she started. There was a pause longer than I expected. The chairman leaned back in his chair, flipping through the documents. Then someone from the audience stood. "I lived next door to June Shaw," said a woman in a floral scarf. I recognized her Mrs. Langley. She used to bring pies to our porch when I was a child. I remember seeing women come and go, quietly, some with black eyes, some with kids. June never asked questions, just made sure they had a roof and a warm meal. She turned to the board. "I think we'd be lucky to have more of that kind of kindness in this town." The room hushed. And just like that, the vote was unanimous. Permits approved. We walked out in silence, too stunned to speak. It wasn't until we reached the parking lot that Melissa let out a loud whoop, startling a pigeon off the roof. "We did it!" she shouted. "No," I corrected softly. "Grant did it. We're just keeping the story going." But I should have known Grant wouldn't let it end there. 2 days later, a reporter knocked on my apartment door. She was young, fresh-faced, and nervous. "I'm sorry to bother you, Miss Shaw," she said, "but I thought you'd want to know there's a blog that just went up. Someone's accusing you of financial improprieties at your old firm. They're linking it to your new project." I took the printed copy she offered, my eyes scanning the screen captures. Allegations of mismanaged funds. Accusations of misusing Grant's inheritance. All vague. All unsupported. All ugly. "Who's behind it?" I asked. She hesitated. "Anonymous, technically. But I traced the hosting domain. It leads back to a shell company. One Grant's name is attached to." The rage bubbled up, hot and fast. I thanked her, closed the door, and sat in the middle of my living room, breathing hard. Grant was trying to strangle this project in its cradle with whispers, innuendo, and smear campaigns. He couldn't own it, so now he wanted to burn it. I forwarded the information to Michael. He responded with 3 words, "Let me handle it," but I couldn't just sit and do nothing. So I got dressed, pulled my hair back, and drove to the house. The mansion was empty, still in its skeleton state, waiting for the contractors to return on Monday. I walked from room to room, touching walls I'd once hidden behind as a little girl, walls Gran had filled with secrets and strength. In the back hallway, I stopped in front of her old bedroom door, and I remembered something vivid and sharp. One night, when I was no more than 12, I'd woken from a nightmare and crept into her bed. She didn't ask what I'd dreamed. She just held me close and whispered, "When someone tries to scare you with shadows, baby girl, you shine a light. That's how you beat them. You don't hide. You shine." I pulled out my phone and opened my social media account, something I hadn't touched since the incident at Lady Bistro. I posted a picture of the mansion's main staircase, dusty, broken, but beautiful in the sunlight. And I wrote, "My ex-husband is spreading lies about me. This isn't new. What is new is that I'm done staying quiet. My grandmother used this house to protect women who had nowhere else to go. I'm rebuilding it for the same reason. And I won't stop, not for shadows, not for whispers, not for anyone." I didn't check the comments that night. I didn't need to. I had said my truth. The next morning, I walked back into the garden. The roses had bloomed overnight, bright red, stubborn, alive. The day after my post went up, something shifted. It wasn't immediate, not like thunder after lightning, but it was there, quiet ripples under the surface. By mid-morning, I had dozens of emails in my inbox. Some from friends I hadn't spoken to since before the divorce. Others from strangers, women mostly, telling me they saw the post and just wanted to say they believed me. One message stood out. "My mother stayed in your grandmother's house when I was 5. I don't remember everything, but I remember safety. I remember feeling safe for the first time." I read it 3 times, tears welling up behind my eyes. Morgan burst into my office around noon, breathless and holding her phone up like a trophy. "Rebecca, you need to see this. Channel 5 picked up your post. They're asking for an interview." "An interview?" I blinked. "I haven't done anything yet. You have. You spoke up, and that matters right now." I stared at her, unsure. Part of me wanted to crawl under a blanket and wait for all the noise to pass. But another part, one I hadn't heard from in a while, wanted to say yes. Not for attention. For truth. For Gran. So I said yes. The reporter was kind, respectful, and older than most I'd expected. Her name was Teresa. We met at the mansion 2 days later, and she asked if we could walk the grounds together while she filmed. "I heard about what happened at the restaurant," she said gently, keeping her eyes on the gravel path. "But I'd like to focus this piece on the project, on what you're building here." I nodded. "That's good, because that's the part of the story James never understood. He thought I'd fall apart once he burned it all down. But some things grow better from ashes." We walked past the rose garden, now in full bloom, and the beginnings of the carriage house renovations. "You're turning this place into something incredible," Teresa said, filming a slow pan of the surrounding property. "But not everyone is thrilled about it." "No, they're not. And your ex-husband?" I paused. "He's doing what men like him always do, trying to control the narrative. But I'm not afraid of him anymore." I didn't realize how much I meant that until the words left my mouth. Later that night, the interview aired in the evening segment. It was gentle but honest, and Teresa's editing was kind. She included just enough of my words to paint a picture, not a spectacle. By the next morning, donations to the Vancouver Center had tripled. 3 new architects reached out to offer help. A nonprofit offered a grant. A team of volunteers showed up on site with gloves and thermoses full of coffee. One woman handed me a picture of her mother in front of the house in 1987, smiling despite the bruise on her cheek. "She used to call your Granty quiet angel," the woman said. "Told me that house saved her life." I couldn't speak. I just hugged her. But not all messages were warm. An anonymous email came through to our info line that afternoon. "You think anyone cares about a spoiled woman whining about soup? You're a gold digger dressed up as a savior. This won't last. Morgan flagged it immediately, forwarding it to our legal team. I've seen this pattern before, she said. They start small emails, whispers, then it escalates. I didn't argue. Instead, I asked Rachel to bring in a cybersecurity consultant. We increased our firewalls, encrypted our internal communications, and installed cameras on site. If Grant wants to play this game, I told Morgan later, he's going to find out I've learned a few moves of my own. But even as we hardened our defenses, the heart of the work kept growing. Sophia unveiled a new design concept for the therapy wing: soft lighting, rounded corners, warm wood tones, and natural textures meant to soothe, not intimidate. The colors were earthy terracotta, soft sage, pale gold. Like Grant's old quilt, I whispered when I saw the rendering. That was the inspiration, Sophia said, smiling. I found a photo of her sewing it on the library floor. That same week, Melissa confirmed that we'd been approved for tax credits and city partnership status. A huge win. But the best moment came when I walked into the in-progress carriage house one morning and found Amy there. She was sweeping up sawdust, wearing jeans and a hoodie. She'd brought a tray of muffins, already picked over by the crew. I wanted to see the place, she said, brushing flour from her sleeve. And maybe just be here. I looked at her closely. There was something steadier in her now. The panic I'd seen in her eyes the first night she came to my apartment had settled into quiet resolve. How are things at the hospital? She shrugged, still tense. But after the story aired, it's like people are finally seeing what was always there. And not just about James. Others? She nodded. It's like you flipped a switch. We sat on the porch steps of the carriage house, watching the contractors work. Do you regret it? She asked suddenly. What? Speaking up, fighting back. I thought about that for a long moment. I regret not doing it sooner. That night, I sat at my desk and opened the notebook. Gran left me. I'd been filling its pages little by little, and now there was only one blank sheet left. So I wrote, he thought the soup would silence me. But all it did was boil away the last of my illusions. Now I see clearly. Now I build without fear. As I closed the notebook, the wind rattled the windows. A storm was coming, but this time I wasn't afraid. Not of Grant, not of whispers, not of being alone, because I wasn't. Not anymore. The knock at my door came just after midnight. At first, I thought it was the wind. The storm that had rolled in earlier that evening had brought with it a torrent of rain and low, grumbling thunder. I'd already locked up the office and was sitting in the library with a blanket around my shoulders, Gran's last letter open in my lap, the kind of night made for tea and long, thoughtful silences. But then came the second knock, sharper, more insistent. I moved slowly, barefoot on the hardwood floor. My heart beat a little faster, even as I told myself it was probably one of the volunteers, someone who got stuck or left something behind. But when I peeked through the side window, I didn't see anyone I recognized. Just a man in a trench coat, collar turned up, rain dripping from his hat. He wasn't soaked like he'd been standing long, but there was something about the way he carried himself, confident, composed, that made my stomach knot. I opened the door only a crack, keeping the chain latched. Can I help you? My voice came out calmer than I felt. Miss S. Shaw? His voice was smooth, professional. My name is Simon Reddick. I'm a private investigator working with the State Medical Board. May I come in? The name didn't ring a bell, but the badge he held up through the gap in the door looked real. I hesitated a beat, then unlatched the chain and let him step inside. Sorry for the hour, he said, taking off his wet hat. We've had some developments in the case against Dr. Harrison. I thought you'd want to be informed directly. I led him to the parlor and offered him a towel, which he declined with a tight shake of his head. Developments? He nodded. A whistleblower stepped forward this evening. Someone close to Dr. Harrison. She turned over emails, phone logs, even surveillance footage. It appears your ex-husband's actions extend beyond what we previously believed. My throat went dry. What do you mean? Reddick opened his satchel and pulled out a manila folder, thick with pages. There's evidence he's been paying off former staff, coordinating efforts to sabotage your project, even hiring someone to tail you for the past 6 weeks. I closed my eyes for a moment, then forced them open. So he really has been watching us. I'm afraid so. I let the information settle, like bricks dropped into water. Heavy, final. I should have been terrified, but I wasn't. Not anymore. I'd known James was desperate, but this proved it. He's losing control, I said. Yes, Reddick agreed. And desperate men make dangerous decisions. He paused. I'm here because there's more. One of the surveillance techs found an unlisted recording from the night of the incident at Le Petit Bistrot. I sat forward, heart suddenly pounding. The original footage? He nodded. Crystal clear, no edits. We plan to turn it over to the board at tomorrow's hearing, but I wanted you to see it first. He reached into the folder and pulled out a tablet. I watched as he queued up the file. Then, with a breath, he handed it to me. And there it was, the dinner. The exact moment James leaned forward, voice clipped, eyes hard, me calmly holding my ground. Then the soup, the sound it made as it hit me, the gasp from the nearby diners, my stunned silence. And then, James wiping his hands coldly, like nothing had happened at all. It was even worse than I remembered. I set the tablet down with trembling hands. Thank you, I said softly, for showing me, for trusting me with it. Reddick rose. The board will move quickly, but I won't sugarcoat it. James has powerful allies. This won't end quietly. I nodded. It never does. Not with men like him. After he left, I sat for a long while in the quiet. The storm had passed, but inside, I felt a different one gathering. The next morning, I called Morgan, Lauren, and Sophia into the office. We're going to the hearing, I said, and we're going prepared. We spent the day assembling our own file testimonies, statements from clients and staff, timelines, and evidence of every stunt James had pulled in the last year. The late-night blog attacks, the hacked emails, the surveillance. This is war now, Morgan muttered, eyes scanning the documents. He's not just trying to discredit you. He wants to erase everything you've built. He can't, I said, with more conviction than I felt. But we have to stop him before he tries again. That night, I sat with Amy in the unfinished atrium. The glass ceiling above us was still half open to the stars, and the air smelled like new wood and rain. He's going to lose his license, isn't he? She asked. I nodded. He should. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said something that caught me off guard. I used to admire him. I looked at her. Me too. Do you think there's a part of him that ever felt remorse? I didn't answer right away. I thought about all the apologies I'd heard from James over the years. Some elaborate, some casual, all hollow. No, I said finally. I think he regrets losing control, but not what he did to get it. She nodded like she understood, because she did. We sat there in the quiet, two women connected by pain, but no longer defined by it. And somewhere inside me, a new question began to bloom. What if he's not the only one? The real story wasn't just James anymore. It was the system that protected him. And that story was only just beginning. What do you think? Is it finally time for women to stop surviving in silence and start changing the rules? Instead, the morning after our team meeting, I walked through the downtown space we were considering for the new Vancouver Centre headquarters. It used to be a bakery, a charming old building with worn oak floors, high ceilings, and a skylight that spilled golden light across the room. You could still smell cinnamon in the air, like memory had soaked into the wood grain. I stood there for a while, picturing what could be: the counseling rooms, the shared workspace, the long community table where survivors would sit, not just to talk, but to dream again. But as always, the shadows followed me. The past doesn't leave quietly. Back at my office, a manila envelope sat on my desk. No postage. No return address. Morgan must have brought it in from the lobby. I opened it slowly, like whatever was inside might bite. Photos, dozens of them. Me, at home, at work, at the grocery store, taken through windows, from across streets, through car windshields. A few of them were recent, my new apartment, clearly visible in the background. Others reached back months. One showed me sitting on a bench outside the studio, bandage still fresh on my neck, coffee in hand, trying to hold myself together. Someone had been watching me for a long time. I looked through them again, slower this time. A few were grainy, taken at night. One in particular made my breath hitch. It was from the night James had thrown the soup, a shot through the restaurant window, me standing up, drenched and furious. The angle was odd, like it had been taken from inside a vehicle. Who would have had these? And why now? Morgan walked in just as I was spreading the photos across the desk. She stopped cold. "What is this?" "I think it's a warning," I said, voice quiet. "To stop?" "No," I said, fingers tightening around the envelope. "To be afraid." She moved beside me, her expression hardening. "You think it's James?" "I think it's someone who doesn't want the Vancouver Center to succeed." We sat in silence. A moment, the hum of the city outside our windows suddenly louder than usual. "Let's document everything," she said finally. "Michael will want a copy. We'll scan them, log the timestamps, get the building security footage from the past few weeks." I nodded. "We also need to warn the others. Walsh, Lauren, everyone on the board. If they're watching me, they could be watching them too." Morgan hesitated. "Should we go to the police?" I wanted to say yes. I wanted to believe that one report would make the problem go away, but I knew better. "Let's get everything together first," I said. "Once we have more than a stack of anonymous photos, we'll go." That night, I didn't sleep. I kept the bedroom lights on, something I hadn't done in months. I checked the locks twice, then 3 times. The wind rattled the windows, and every creak of the old pipes felt like a footstep. I hated it, that feeling of being hunted again. James had used fear as a weapon for years, and now someone else was trying the same tactic. But I was no longer the same woman. By morning, I was angry, not scared, furious. At noon, I met with Michael and Lauren at our usual coffee shop, one of the few places that still felt safe. We reviewed the photos together, scanning each one for clues. "Some of these were taken from a high vantage point," Lauren noted. "Maybe a nearby building. We could cross-reference this one." She pointed to an image of me leaving the studio, with building access logs from the property across the street. Michael was quiet, flipping the images like cards in a magician's deck. "They're watching your routines," he said, "trying to find patterns, weak points. Let them try," I said, voice sharp. "They'll find nothing but steel." Still, we tightened everything. Upgraded security at the new studio, rotated our daily patterns, even rerouted staff commutes. But we didn't slow down. We couldn't afford to. That same week, Morgan introduced me to a woman named Elaine, a trauma therapist who'd survived her own harrowing escape from a controlling marriage. Now, she trained counselors on recognizing psychological abuse in high-functioning couples. We met at a cafe, her smile gentle but eyes sharp with recognition. "James?" she asked quietly. I nodded. "They're all the same," she said. "They smile in public, hold doors open, charm your friends. And when no one's looking, they turn to stone." I told her about the Vancouver Center, our vision, our fight. "I want in," she said without hesitation. "I'll train your staff, help screen applicants, whatever you need." For the first time in a while, I felt that old flicker again hope. Until 2 days later, when I arrived at the center to find the windows shattered, glass glittered across the sidewalk like ice, spray painted across the front door in red, "Stop or else." Morgan arrived just behind me, gasping at the sight. "I'll call the police," she said, already reaching for her phone. "No," I said, stepping forward, glass crunching underfoot. "Call the press." She blinked at me. "We're not hiding," I said. "Let them see who's afraid of us." She nodded slowly. "Then I'll call Sarah too. Sarah Martinez, our PR consultant, who knew how to take a threat and turn it into a rallying cry." As I stood in front of the shattered windows, sunlight slicing through the damage, I knew this wasn't just about me anymore. They weren't trying to stop me. They were trying to stop every woman we were helping, every story we were telling, which meant they were already losing. And now I had a question for whoever was listening. What would you do if your abuser tried to follow you into your healing? Would you hide? Or would you fight back with everything you had left? By the time the police finished their report, the press vans were already parking across the street. Sarah Martinez arrived in a fitted navy coat, her hair pulled back and her expression unreadable, what I'd come to call her crisis face. She gave the damage one sweeping glance before striding up to me. "Let's turn this into fuel," she said quietly, glancing at the reporters gathering near the sidewalk. "We'll issue a statement within the hour. Morgan's drafting it. We frame it not as a setback, but as proof the work we're doing is shaking something loose." I looked at the red spray paint still drying on the glass. "Stop, or else. If this is what intimidation looks like," I said softly, "then we must be doing something right." Sarah nodded. "Exactly. But I want you to be safe while we do it." That night, I didn't go back to my apartment. Instead, I stayed with Lauren, who had a guest bedroom and a husband who worked night shifts. It wasn't ideal, but it was safer. And it gave Morgan time to coordinate with private security firms and update the safety protocols for our team. Still, sleep was elusive. In the quiet of the unfamiliar room, I lay awake wondering who else was watching, who else knew about my past, about James. It didn't take long to get an answer. 3 days later, Michael walked into my office holding a large brown envelope, his expression somewhere between furious and stunned. "You need to see this," he said, shutting the door behind him. Inside the envelope were printed screenshots, dozens of them, posts from an anonymous blog titled "The Truth About the Vancouver Center." The claims were absurd, almost laughable if they hadn't been so dangerous. That we were exploiting survivors. That we were fabricating abuse claims for political gain. That I had mental instability and a vendetta against my ex-husband, a respected surgeon. There were even fabricated screenshots of bank transfers and medical records digitally altered, but convincing enough to give pause. I held the papers in shaking hands. Where'd this come from? Michael sat down across from me. The blog went live last night, shared on several conservative message boards. Some medical forums, too. "James?" I asked. Not directly, but some of the usernames match ones connected to his former colleagues. "There's a coordinated effort here." I stared at the words. "How many people have seen it?" "Thousands." "But here's the thing," he said, leaning forward. "Most of the responses are calling it out for what it is, smear tactics. And we've had an uptick in messages from survivors today. More people are reaching out, wanting to help. They're trying to bury us," I whispered. Michael's voice was calm, but certain. "And they're digging their own grave instead." The next few days were a storm. We doubled our security team. Sarah ran media interference like a seasoned general. And Elaine began training our staff to recognize the signs of psychological warfare, not just in personal lives, but in public narratives too. It was Morgan who brought the team a new idea during our emergency strategy session. "What if we get ahead of it?" she said. "Take the power back. Not a press release, not a denial, but a documentary. Our story, our voices, interviews, testimonies, footage from the early days of the center. Let people see the real story behind the headlines." A hush fell over the room. Then Lauren nodded. "I know a filmmaker in Portland. She's done advocacy work. She'll understand what we're trying to build." It wasn't just a good idea. It was our next weapon. And this time, we weren't playing defense. We brought in survivors who wanted to share. We collected footage of our work, the art therapy sessions, the financial literacy classes, the design studio, humming with life. We even filmed Elaine giving a talk about emotional coercion in high-performing relationships. At first, it was painful, sitting in front of a camera, telling the worst moment of your life to someone holding a boom mic. But there was something freeing about it too. One of the first women to speak was Linda. Her voice trembled at first, then grew stronger. "He said I'd never survive without him," she told the Lens. "But now I teach women how to manage their own money, how to start over. I found my power right here." Each voice added another brick to the foundation. By the time we finished the rough cut of the film, something else had happened. The smear blog? It had been taken down. The anonymous poster's IP address had been traced to a known troll farm tied to James's former hospital board. Legal action was underway, but by then, the damage had already turned into something else. Momentum. 2 days after the blog vanished, we received a letter from a women's foundation in New York. They wanted to fund our documentary and host a national premiere. That night, sitting in the quiet office, I picked up one of the photographs from that anonymous envelope, the one of me sitting on a bench after the soup incident. I looked exhausted, bruised, alone. But now, as I stared at it, I saw something else. I saw survival. That version of me didn't yet know what would come next: the courtroom battles, the betrayals, the smears, the roses that would bloom anyway. But she was still here, still fighting, still rising. And somewhere out there, I knew, another woman was sitting alone, trying to make sense of what had happened to her, wondering if she was broken, if she deserved better, if she could start over. This film wouldn't just be for our center, it would be for her. And maybe when she saw it, she'd believe that healing wasn't just possible, it was her right, just like it was mine. Do you think exposing the truth publicly like this could backfire, or is it finally the justice survivors deserve? The morning of the premiere came with a cold drizzle, not the dramatic storm we half expected, just a persistent, quiet mist, like the world was holding its breath. We'd chosen a small independent theater in downtown Seattle, cozy, intimate, the kind of place that smelled faintly of popcorn and old velvet, where the seats creaked when you shifted your weight and the marquee outside still required someone to climb a ladder and slide in each letter by hand. Morgan had organized everything with military precision press packets, NDAs for media outlets, a private post-screening discussion room for survivors only. I arrived early, not because I had to, but because I needed the silence before the voices arrived, before the lights dimmed and the film started to roll, before I watched the story of my own unraveling and rebuilding play out on screen. Lauren was already there, nervously adjusting a vase of white roses in the lobby. "I thought they'd be symbolic," she said, catching me looking. "You know, Grant's favorite." I nodded. "She would have loved this. She'd be proud," Lauren said gently. She already was. When the crowd began trickling in, I recognized some familiar faces, survivors from the early days, some of our new program graduates, hospital staff who had quietly supported us through the worst. But there were unfamiliar faces too. That was when I realized something important. The story wasn't just ours anymore. The film ran just under an hour. It started with a shot of the Victorian mansion, the roses in full bloom. Then slowly, through voiceovers and interviews, the deeper truths unfolded about James, about the culture of silence, about the systemic rot we'd uncovered beneath the glossy veneer of hospital accolades. I hadn't expected to cry, but when Linda's segment came up, her soft voice describing the moment she realized she wasn't crazy, just controlled, I felt it rise. Not grief, not fear, pride. By the end, the theater was silent. Then applause, hesitant at first, then stronger, fierce. Like everyone had to put something back into the air that had been taken from them. The lights came up. In the back of the room, a woman stood slowly. I recognized her face from a few of our support sessions. Her name was Cora. She'd come in after fleeing a wealthy, connected husband who reminded me too much of James. Her voice shook. I've never said this out loud, but I used to think if I left, no one would believe me, that he was too charming, too respected. But watching that, she gestured to the screen, I realized I'm not alone. I never was. Others followed. Not confessions exactly, more like exhalations. Moments where people let go of the shame they'd been gripping like armor. The post-screening discussion was supposed to last an hour. We were still there, 3 hours later. When we finally stepped out into the misty night, I felt lighter than I had in years, until I saw the black sedan parked across the street. James's lawyer, Richard Stanford, stepped out, his suit immaculate, his face unreadable. Morgan was beside me in a heartbeat. What now? Stanford didn't approach, just watched, like a man sizing up a building he couldn't enter anymore. You think he'll try again? I asked. Morgan didn't answer right away. Then she said, I think he's watching the house burn and hoping there's still a match left in his pocket. The match came 3 days later. An emergency injunction filed in federal court, claiming the film defamed James and violated patient confidentiality. It was signed not just by James, but 2 other former doctors named in our documentation men we'd never even met in person, but who had everything to lose if the public took our story seriously. What's their angle? I asked Michael, scanning the legal paperwork. Delay, distraction, intimidation, he said flatly. If they can't disprove the truth, they'll try to scare you into silence. Classic. Well, I said, folding the pages neatly, they're going to have to try harder. Morgan walked into the room with her phone in hand. You're going to want to see this. She held up a video. It had been uploaded anonymously to a secure survivor forum. A young woman, early 20s, pale, eyes rimmed with tears, spoke directly into the camera. He told me I was imagining things, that I was too sensitive, that if I reported him, no one would believe me because he was friends with the chief of surgery. My stomach turned. The man she described wasn't James, but it was the same pattern, different name, same poison. They think this film is the danger, I said quietly, but the real threat is what it's unlocking. A few hours later, I received an email from Boston. Dr. Patricia Chen had shared the documentary with a group of faculty at a medical conference. Now they were requesting permission to screen it at schools across the Northeast as part of a new ethics curriculum. You said you wanted to create change, she wrote. Well, you just lit the fuse. But every fire brings smoke, and someone was watching. That night, as I sat in the living room flipping through the next round of architecture plans for our expansion sites, I noticed something strange. An email notification from a sender I didn't recognize. Subject, I know what you took. I opened it. Inside, a single line. She didn't leave them to you. She stole them. Attached was a scan of an old deed from the 1970s, with Gran's name on it, but also another name, circled in red. A name I didn't recognize. I stared at it, my heart starting to race. Then I forwarded it to Morgan. She called me 30 seconds later. Where did this come from? She asked. Anonymous email. The language is meant to sound threatening. Do you think it's real? I hesitated. I don't know. Morgan was silent for a beat. Let's find out. If there's anything in Gran's past they can twist to cast doubt on your inheritance, they'll try. We need to get ahead of it. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. I'll start with the archives tomorrow, I said. Gran kept everything. Somewhere in those files is the truth. Let's hope so, Morgan replied. Because if they can shake your legal claim to the property, she didn't finish. She didn't have to. Because if they could do that, they could destroy everything. The next morning, I sat cross-legged on the floor of Gran's old study, surrounded by boxes that smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. Dust floated in the morning light, like tiny ghosts. It felt sacred in here, in the way some places do when they've held secrets for too long. I opened a brittle manila folder labeled 1972, 1979 property files. Inside, a stack of handwritten receipts, city permits, letters from local council members, some typed, some scrawled in looping cursive. And then, tucked inside a linen envelope, I found the original purchase agreement for the Victorian mansion. Gran's name was there, clear as day. But what caught my eye was a second signature, just beneath hers, Margaret A. LeClaire, the same name from the scanned deed in the email. Found her, I whispered, snapping a photo and sending it to Morgan. She called within minutes. I ran her name through public records, she said. Margaret LeClaire was the original owner, yes, but she died in 1975. No spouse, no children, no legal heirs. So why is someone pretending she's relevant now? That's what we need to figure out, Morgan said. Because if they can sow enough doubt about how Gran acquired the property, they might try to argue the inheritance was illegitimate. Even if it's a stretch, the optics could be damaging. I closed the folder gently. Let them try. We agreed to have Michael and his paralegal team verify every signature, every deed. But deep down, I already knew Gran had done everything by the book. She always had. That evening, I wandered through the garden. The roses had started to thin for the season, a reminder that even the most beautiful things go quiet for a time before they bloom again. I could feel her here, in the rustle of the leaves, in the way the soil still held warmth even as the air cooled. "You kept everything," I murmured, "even the hard truths." Just then, my phone buzzed. A message from a number I didn't recognize. "You should have taken the settlement. This won't end well for you." I stared at it for a long moment, the screen glowing cold against my palm. And then I did something I hadn't done since that night. James threw the soup. I laughed. It wasn't hysterical or bitter. It was quiet, tired, but it was real, because they still didn't get it. This wasn't about fear anymore. It wasn't even about revenge. It was about light, truth, and how, once you let it in, darkness just didn't have the same hold anymore. The next morning, while I was still sorting records, Morgan rushed in breathless. "You need to see this." She opened her tablet and showed me a clip from a local morning news show. James was back. Fresh haircut, gray suit. The concerned hero looked perfected. "I've made mistakes," he said, voice heavy with fake humility. "But I've also saved lives, and I believe people deserve second chances." Beside him stood a woman I didn't recognize at first. Young, pretty, late 20s maybe, eyes like a deer caught in headlights. "This is my fiancée, Doctor. Elise Thomas," James announced with a smile that didn't touch his eyes. "Together, we're founding a new children's surgical outreach center." Morgan paused the video. "He's launching a new nonprofit." I shook my head. "It's a distraction. It's also bait," she added. "Look at the tagline, redemption through care." He's weaponizing victimhood now, trying to recast himself as the wounded healer. "He always was good at performance," I said. "The problem is, the script's getting old." Michael called shortly after. "Rebecca," he said, "we've confirmed the LeClaire deed. It's authentic. But it was part of a community preservation effort. Your grandmother legally purchased the building through a collective agreement with the city and the historical committee. The files are pristine. Then why the anonymous threat? Because the truth doesn't matter to people like James. Only doubt does." That evening, I got another message. This time, it wasn't threatening. It was a video file. A woman, mid-40s, sat in a dimly lit kitchen. Her face was tired but determined. "I don't know who to send this to, but I saw your documentary," she said. "My name is Celeste, and I used to work with James. He wasn't just cruel to his wife. He bullied interns, silenced nurses, stole credit for surgeries." Her eyes welled up. "I filed a complaint once. It disappeared. After that, my hours were cut. I was told I wasn't a good culture fit. I ended up leaving medicine." She looked down, ashamed, but I kept everything. Emails, recordings, notes. "If this helps anyone, it's yours." I sat there in silence, the weight of it pressing into my chest. Not sadness, not guilt, purpose. I sent the video to Morgan and Michael. "She's not the first," Morgan texted back, "and she won't be the last." At our next board meeting, we voted unanimously to expand our digital archive to include not just survivor testimony, but whistleblower evidence from within systems like hospitals, law enforcement, and social services. "This is what happens," Lauren said softly, "when the door stays open long enough. People stop knocking. They walk through." But of course, James didn't sit still. 3 days later, a new website launched. The Real Vancouver Story Anonymous. Slick, filled with misinformation. Claims that the center misused funds. That survivors were being coached. That Gran had misled the community. It was full of lies. But it had teeth. Because fear is contagious. That night, while I was locking up the design studio, I noticed something strange. The window in the front office was cracked. Not broken from the outside, but from within. As if someone had tried to open it and lost their temper. I checked the security footage. Nothing. Except at 3:12 am, a shadow appeared on the edge of the camera's view. No face. Just movement. Deliberate. Too calm to be random. I called Morgan. Then I called Michael. Then, reluctantly, I called the police. When the officer arrived, he was polite, professional, but I could feel it in his tone, that doubt, that soft insinuation. "No signs of forced entry," he said, shining a flashlight along the sill. "Could be an accident or a warning." The next morning, someone had spray painted the back fence. Liar, red, dripping, fresh. I stood there for a long time, then picked up the phone. "Get me a film crew," I told Morgan. "I want to document this." "Are you sure?" "Yes," I said. "Because if they're escalating, it means we're getting closer. And if we're getting closer, they're running out of time." The next few days passed in a haze of meetings, interviews, and urgent planning. We hired a local security company to install motion lights and reinforced locks across the Vancouver Centre's properties. Every camera was upgraded. Every corner now had eyes. Still, it didn't shake the feeling that someone was always watching. That same pressure at the back of my neck, the kind I used to feel when I'd hear James's footsteps too close behind me after a disagreement. Only now, it wasn't just about me. This was bigger. There were over 50 women staying in the shelter, 12 employees, 4 interns, an entire ecosystem of safety that James was determined to undermine. But no one flinched. No one asked to be reassigned. In fact, the team pulled closer. "We've survived worse," Morgan said flatly, as she handed out crisis protocols at our staff meeting. "And if he thinks he can bully us back into silence, he's forgotten who we are." Lauren added a new module to the employee training, one focused on digital warfare and smear campaigns. Rachel doubled the trauma response team's counseling hours. Dr. Walsh reached out to our hospital partners, ensuring each survivor would be shielded from retaliatory care decisions. We weren't just preparing for fallout, we were preparing for war. That week, the press caught wind of the spray-painted fence. The local paper ran a photo of me standing next to it, no smile, just steel in my eyes. The headline read, "Vancouver Centre targeted as abuse reform gains ground." The article went viral within hours, and something incredible happened. Letters began pouring in, not emails, not tweets, actual handwritten letters, some shaky and faint with age, some from young women in college, some from nurses, librarians, ministers, truck drivers. "I was told to shut up too," one said. "I didn't. I lost everything. But reading about what you're doing makes me think maybe it wasn't for nothing. We need places like the Vancouver Centre." Another read. "Keep going. We're behind you." I pinned everyone to the old corkboard in the reception hallway, the way Gran used to post neighborhood bake sale flyers and holiday toy drives. Only now, that board was a living monument to every voice that had once been silenced. And still, James wasn't done. 2 days later, the IRS opened an audit on our nonprofit status. It came with no warning, no courtesy call, just a registered letter and a stack of paperwork a foot high. "They're trying to drown us in red tape," Michael said grimly, as we reviewed the demands. "The audit isn't random. Someone pulled strings. Can they shut us down?" I asked. "If they can prove any discrepancies, yes. But we've kept everything clean. Gran taught you well." Still, the weight of it pressed against my chest like concrete. I knew the power of bureaucracy, how even a false accusation could destroy funding, close programs, cast shadows where there had only been light. I spent the next 72 hours in the office, reviewing receipts, payroll records, bank transfers. Gran had left behind immaculate books, but she'd also left handwritten notes in the margins, ones the IRS wouldn't care about, ones that mattered to me. March 12, 1993, Miriam's little boy needed shoes. Took from the cash box. Reimbursed next day. August 4, 1987, paid Joe an eggs for fixing the plumbing. He refused cash. Every scribble told a story. Every story was a life she touched. I knew I couldn't let James erase that. Morgan brought in a pro bono financial forensics team to help us organize every page. "If they want proof of integrity," she said, "we'll give them more than they bargained for." Meanwhile, Lauren reached out to a friend at a national investigative news outlet. 3 days later, they released a full expose on James's media manipulation campaign. complete with whistleblower accounts, old malpractice settlements, and court filings that had conveniently disappeared over the years. He responded the next day with a press conference. He stood outside his new children's outreach clinic, flanked by volunteers in matching T-shirts. "I won't be intimidated by false allegations," he said, his voice calm, rehearsed. "My focus is on healing, not hate." He gestured to a line of children in hospital gowns. He was still playing the savior, still casting himself as the misunderstood genius under siege. The comments were split. Some cheered him, others called out his manipulation. But we didn't have time to dwell, because while James was busy throwing mud, our foundation was growing. That weekend, Celeste, whose video testimony had come in anonymously, came to the center for the first time. She was quiet, pale. She held a manila envelope like it might explode. "I kept these for years," she said as we sat in the garden. "Didn't know if I ever wanted to look at them again. But after seeing what you're building," she handed them to me. Inside were printed emails, photos of charts with altered dates, a journal she kept for nearly a year, documenting verbal abuse, sexual harassment, financial fraud. "I never thought I'd be brave enough to bring this out," she whispered. "You don't have to be brave," I told her. "Just honest." She smiled. That's what he was most afraid of, you know. Women who told the truth. Celeste's records opened the next door. 2 more women came forward by the following week. Then 6. Some in medicine, some in administration, some in janitorial positions who'd been dismissed for inappropriate behavior when they'd reported misconduct. Each carried a piece of the puzzle, and together, the picture was finally becoming whole. Not just of James, but of the entire system that enabled him. Dr. Walsh called a coalition meeting at the hospital. She invited medical board members, lawmakers, administrators. "Enough is enough," she said. "We need federal reform, not more Band-Aids." Lauren stood beside her, holding a printed report with our logo on the front. The Vancouver Standard, a survivor-centered blueprint for institutional change. It was no longer just a dream. It was a plan. And James? He could feel it slipping. The day after that meeting, someone left a dead crow on the back steps of the center, wrapped in surgical gauze. No note, no fingerprints, but I knew. And yet, as I stood there with Morgan and Rachel and our maintenance lead staring down at that poor broken bird, I didn't flinch. "Clean it up," I said, "then plant another rose bush." That night, as I closed up the office, I sat at Gran's desk again, surrounded by the scent of paper and cedar and rain. Her ledger sat open beside me. A single page fluttered in the breeze from the cracked window. At the bottom, in her slanted script, were the words, "When the roots are deep, the storm can't pull it free." I leaned back and closed my eyes. James had tried everything: lawsuits, threats, media slander, bureaucratic sabotage. But his biggest mistake had always been underestimating the soil we'd grown from. And no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't unplant us. "Here is the crow" wasn't the last warning. 3 days later, someone slashed the tires on our staff van. A week after that, a board member's husband received a threatening phone call at his law office. No names were given, just a slow, gravelly voice saying, "Tell your wife to back off before she's next." By then, we weren't shocked anymore. The fear had changed shape. It wasn't sharp or sudden like it once had been. Now it pulsed low and constant, like a heartbeat, always there, always reminding us James wasn't finished, but neither were we. Every threat gave us more reason to fight. I started carrying Gran's old notebook with me everywhere. Not the one with financials or board notes, but the small, cracked leather one she'd called her rose book. In it, she had written little sayings, sometimes prayers, sometimes just reflections from women she'd helped. On the inside cover, in faded ink, she'd scrawled, "There is no violence as quiet or as lasting as hope." I read that line every morning now, sometimes twice. Morgan took charge of safety planning while Lauren coordinated with federal contacts about the growing smear campaign. But it was Rachel who brought the idea that changed everything. "We're being watched," she said, pointing to the security footage. "So why not use it?" She meant it literally. We had cameras on every floor, in every common space, around every building. What if we turned our own surveillance into storytelling? What if we show people what healing actually looks like? She asked. Let them see what James is trying to destroy. That's how the documentary was born. We didn't bring in a crew, not at first. It started with handheld footage, residents cooking together in the communal kitchen. A group therapy session where someone whispered, "I didn't think I'd live to 30." A little boy's laughter echoing through the stairwell as his mom chased him, smiling in a way I'd never seen before. Each clip was a thread in a growing tapestry. We called it From the Ashes. And within 2 weeks of soft launching the first 10-minute segment on our website, it had been shared over 100,000 times. The world was finally listening. More women came forward, not just from James's circle, but from other hospitals, other towns. One woman from Denver emailed us, "I thought what happened to me was an isolated case. Now I know it was a pattern." A surgeon from Minneapolis wrote, "I was told I had a bad attitude. Now I see I was just inconvenient to the wrong men. They didn't want revenge. Most didn't even want their names shared. They just wanted to be believed." James countered with a lawsuit, his fifth. This one accused us of orchestrating a coordinated public shaming campaign designed to irreparably damage his reputation and financial well-being. It named me personally, along with Morgan, Lauren, Dr. Walsh, and several former residents who had gone public. We met in Michael's office the next morning. "Can he drag us into court again?" Rachel asked, arms crossed tightly. "He can try," Michael replied, "but he's losing credibility fast." "He doesn't need credibility," Lauren said. "He just needs to wear us down." I stood by the window, watching the morning mist rise over the parking lot. Somewhere down the street, a blue sedan idled, same one that had circled the block yesterday. We'd started keeping logs. "He's not after court wins," I said softly. "He's after delay, distraction, chaos. But we don't move in chaos," Morgan added. "We build in it." That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay on the couch in my office, Gran's rose book open on my chest. There was an entry I hadn't seen before tucked behind a dried petal, its ink bleeding into the page. They tried to bury us, not knowing we were seeds. Gran had circled it twice. I whispered it aloud, again and again, until the fear loosened its grip on my lungs. The next morning, we announced our biggest project yet. We were going national. 3 new centers. Partnerships in Chicago, Atlanta, and Tucson. Trauma-informed design plans, medical advocacy teams, survivor-led programming, and a new public fund called the Gran Fund, meant to provide emergency legal and financial assistance to women at risk of institutional abuse. We knew what James would do, and he didn't disappoint. He scheduled an emergency press conference. Cameras lined the hospital walkway as he stepped forward, flanked by a PR firm and 2 new lawyers. He looked thinner now, edgier, like the mask was fraying at the corners. "I've spent my career saving lives," he said, voice smooth, practiced. "Now, I watch as a vendetta campaign dismantles my legacy under the guise of progress." He paused, eyes narrowing at the cameras. "There are people who would rather burn down an entire hospital than admit they misunderstood a difficult man." It was a performance. The same old show, but this time, fewer people applauded, because behind him, just over his shoulder, someone held up a sign. White cardboard, black marker. It read, "Ask me how he treated the nurses," James faltered. Only a second, but it was enough. Later that day, a woman named Deirdre, former ER nurse, fired under suspicious circumstances in 2018, uploaded her own video, calm, direct, full of receipts. He yelled at me in front of a child. When I reported him, they said I was too emotional. I'd worked there for 11 years. By the end of the week, 10 more videos had followed. And just like that, the tide turned. Hospitals that had been quietly supportive of James began pulling back. Donors withdrew. A medical ethics review was announced. We didn't gloat. We didn't celebrate. Because this wasn't just about him. This was about every woman who had whispered in the dark, "Maybe it's me." It was about every resident who dropped out after being told she wasn't strong enough. It was about Gran, and every note she ever scribbled, every tea she brewed for a woman who just needed an hour of silence and a safe place to cry. At our next staff meeting, we added a new ritual. We read a letter from a survivor at the start of every week. Just one. Just a voice that might have been lost, now finally heard. The first one read, "I used to think healing meant forgetting. Now I know it means remembering differently." We passed it around the table in silence, each of us touching the page like a prayer. Later that evening, I walked the garden path outside the carriage house. The air smelled like honeysuckle and fresh mulch. In the shadows, Gran's roses nodded in the breeze. The petals were so delicate. The next phase came quietly, almost too quietly. James hadn't made a public move in nearly 3 weeks. No lawsuits, no press appearances, not even a blog post from one of his shadow accounts. Just silence. It should have been a relief, but it wasn't. Silence from men like him isn't peace. It's planning. We were in the middle of finalizing the blueprints for the Atlanta location when the first email arrived. It was from an anonymous sender using a burner account. The subject line, "Are you sure about your grandmother?" The body of the message was short, just a photo of an old property deed and a single line of text. "Maybe you should look a little closer at how she really got those buildings." At first, I dismissed it. Another scare tactic, another attempt to shake the foundation literally of what we'd built. But Morgan's face went pale when I forwarded it to her. "That's the original deed to the 7th Avenue property," she said, squinting at the scanned document. "It's authentic, and it's not in your grandmother's name." I felt the ground shift a little beneath my feet. "Could be forged," I offered, though my voice didn't quite believe it. "Or someone found a piece we never saw," she said. "You said she kept everything, right? Everything she wanted us to see." The next few days blurred into paper trails and old files. We dug back through Gran's journals, the storage boxes in the basement, and even the attic crawl space where she used to hide Christmas gifts. And that's when we found the red folder. It was tucked behind a row of mystery novels on a bookshelf in her study books she never loaned out, never moved. I pulled it free, and dust filled the air. Inside were letters, dozens of them. Correspondence with a woman named Eleanor Price. The name meant nothing to me at first, but as we read through the letters, a story began to unfold. Eleanor was the original owner of several of the properties Gran later purchased. She had once run a small shelter there, unofficial, church-funded, and deeply private. When the church pulled funding and the city began pressuring for a rezoning deal with developers, Eleanor had panicked. She didn't want the buildings to go to the men who'd tried to silence her efforts. So she'd come to Gran. The letters were deeply personal. Eleanor was sick, some kind of aggressive cancer. She didn't trust banks, lawyers, or paperwork. She'd signed the deed over in haste, scribbled contracts in notebooks, a few with witness signatures, many without. She trusted Gran to do the right thing, to keep the buildings safe. And Gran had. But it wasn't clean, not in the legal sense, which meant James had found a crack. By Monday, his lawyers had filed a formal petition to challenge the original property transfers of 3 key buildings, our founding locations. He wasn't coming after me this time. He was coming after Gran's memory. I sat in the garden that night, the red folder in my lap, surrounded by the hum of summer insects and the rustle of the wind through the rose bushes. Everything we'd built stood on this woman's legacy. And now, the man who'd tried to destroy me was trying to erase her. Morgan joined me just after sunset, barefoot, holding 2 mugs of tea. "He's going for optics," she said, handing me one. "Wants to make it look like the whole foundation is tainted." "But it's not," I replied, opening one of Eleanor's letters again. "It's imperfect, but it's good." Morgan sat beside me on the stone bench. "You know what Gran would say right now?" I looked up at her, tired. "No, but I bet you do." She'd say, "Truth doesn't have to be clean. It just has to be clear." We built our legal response around that idea. Not denial, not deflection, just the full story, messy, human, honest. We reached out to Eleanor's family. Her granddaughter, a woman named Shay, responded first. She'd known about the buildings, knew her grandmother gave them away in a panic. She didn't want to challenge the transfer, she wanted to help. She always said those houses saved more lives than she ever could, Shay told me over the phone. If I can help protect that legacy, I will. By the end of the week, we had sworn statements, archived church records, and even an old photograph of Eleanor and Gran standing together on the porch of the main house, arms linked like sisters in defiance. We included all of it in our legal packet, not just because it helped our case, but because it told the truth. And sometimes, truth matters more than strategy. At the emergency hearing, James didn't show. He sent a lawyer I hadn't seen before, slick, polished, no soul behind the eyes. But as our legal team laid out the story, as Morgan read part of Eleanor's final letter to the court, something changed in the room. It wasn't just a hearing anymore. It was a reckoning. The judge didn't make a ruling that day, but her words were telling. "I see no evidence of malicious intent," she said. "Only a chain of imperfect but heartfelt decisions meant to protect vulnerable lives." That counts for something. Outside the courthouse, cameras waited. We didn't speak to them. Not yet. Instead, we returned to the center, where a small group of women were hanging a new piece of artwork in the main corridor, a mosaic. Shards of broken tiles, forming the shape of a flame. Above it, in bold, hand-painted script, "Truth isn't always tidy, but it's always light." We stood in silence, watching the final tile fall into place. In the end, James's attempt to smear Gran's legacy had backfired, because instead of sowing doubt, he'd invited the world into her story, and they'd found it worthy. That night, as the summer air settled over Vancouver and the roses began to close in the dark, I pressed my palm to the wall, beside the mosaic. The grout was still drying. It smelled like earth and lemon and possibility. Gran was never a perfect woman, but she was a true one, and I intended to be the same. The morning after the court hearing, I awoke to birdsong and the low, familiar hum of construction outside. For once, it didn't fill me with dread. It was the sound of forward movement, of something growing instead of being torn down. Gran's name had survived the test. James had thrown everything he could at her memory, and it didn't stick. In fact, it only deepened the roots of our work. Still, I wasn't naive enough to think it was over. Morgan texted early, "Can you meet me in the conference room in 10:10:10? Something's come up." I dressed quickly and made my way through the center. A new mural was being painted in the East Wing blues and greens, swirling into an ocean scene, with women rising from the waves. I smiled as I passed, hand trailing the drying edges of the wall. Morgan was waiting, her laptop open, eyes locked on the screen. She didn't look up. "Someone's leaking internal memos," she said without preamble. "Board meeting notes, financial drafts, even drafts of resident intake forms. They're out of context, but if you squint, it looks messy." I walked over slowly and read the post she had opened. A social media page under an anonymous name had posted screenshots of our meeting agendas and staff communications with captions like, "Where's the accountability?" and "Is this transparency or manipulation?" My stomach turned. It was subtle enough to stir doubt, but not enough to trace. "James?" I asked. Morgan shook her head. "Maybe, but this feels different. Sloppier, petty, less strategic." She clicked over to another post, a cropped image of me from a private donor event, wine glass in hand. Mid-laugh, the caption read, "Some people profit off other people's pain." It felt personal, but not smart. And James, whatever else he was always calculated. "I don't think this is him," I said slowly. Morgan nodded. "Me neither." I checked staff records and flagged access history. One of our junior coordinators, Eileen Markson, downloaded nearly all these files last week. Her credentials, her login, her device. Eileen, 25, soft-spoken, eager to please. She'd only been with us 6 months. "Have you spoken to her?" "She's not answering calls. Didn't show up for work this morning. Her emergency contact, her brother said she left town for a mental health break." I sat down, overwhelmed by the new weight of it. We'd grown so fast. Too fast, maybe. New hires, new protocols, new layers of complexity. Somewhere in the rapid expansion, we'd let someone in who didn't believe in the mission, or maybe just didn't understand it. Morgan closed her laptop. "We'll clean it up. It's not what they're saying that hurts, it's that they're trying to make people stop trusting. And that was the truth of it. The real damage wasn't reputational, it was relational. This place had always been built on trust. I spent the afternoon with Rachel in our trauma-informed project planning office, reviewing the vetting process for incoming staff. We tightened guidelines, added new steps. Transparency without exposure, protection without paranoia. Still, something lingered. That night, I sat on the old front porch of the Victorian house, the place where Gran used to drink her chamomile tea and talk to the moon like it was a friend. The wind had picked up, and the scent of roses drifted through the air, soft and wild. My phone buzzed. "Lauren, we've got a bigger problem," she said. No greeting. "James just filed a federal claim. He's alleging that the Vancouver Center is part of a coordinated defamation ring across state lines, says. We're inciting false testimony to damage his ability to work." I stared at the dark yard, heart thudding. Isn't that baseless? Completely. But it's enough to trigger a federal inquiry if they take the bait. It's his last shot, and he's aiming high. What does he gain? I asked. He's already lost his license. He doesn't care about winning anymore, Lauren said quietly. He cares about hurting you on the way down. I swallowed. It was true. This wasn't a legal play. It was a legacy war. He wanted my name smeared so I'd always be tied to his fall. After the call, I wandered inside and stopped in the hallway, where we kept our wall of firsts photos of the first woman to graduate from our recovery program, the first daycare child to start kindergarten, the first mural painted by survivors. I ran my fingers over each frame. This wasn't about me. Not anymore. Maybe it never really had been. The next day, Morgan and I held a town hall, meeting with the core staff. We explained the leaks, addressed the lawsuit, laid bare every uncomfortable truth. We showed them what transparency really looked like. Not the absence of conflict, but the courage to face it together. Eileen's actions stung, but we refused to let one betrayal rot the whole tree. We reopened applications for her position, this time choosing more slowly, more carefully. By the end of the week, 3 major publications had reached out requesting interviews. They wanted my response to the lawsuit, to the whispers about mismanagement, to the growing tension between what we were and what others were trying to paint us as. I said no to all of them. We didn't need more words. We needed more work. So we doubled down. Our team expanded outreach to rural clinics. Maria's art therapy exhibit was accepted into a national mental health conference. Dr. Walsh and Amy finalized a toolkit to train hospital administrators on identifying subtle power abuse. The impact was rippling, and yet, every step forward seemed to summon a shadow behind it. Late one night, as I locked up after a long staff strategy meeting, I noticed a figure across the street, parked in a car. Lights off, watching, I stood on the porch, unmoving. The car pulled away. No plate I could read, no face I could see. But I knew he was still watching, still waiting, still hoping I'd fall apart. But the difference now? I wasn't standing alone anymore. The next morning began with a familiar feeling tightness in my chest that only came when the past tried to crawl back into the present. I'd grown used to the silence before the next blow, the way calm settled just long enough to make you hope things might be okay, only for the storm to rattle the windows all over again. I sat at my kitchen table, stirring cream into my coffee, watching the steam curl up and disappear like breath in the cold. Outside, the roses Gran planted still bloomed, strong, despite the season shifting. Somehow, those flowers always knew how to keep going. Maybe that's why I held on so tightly to this house, this center. It reminded me that resilience could be quiet, even beautiful. Morgan arrived just after 9, a file in hand and tension in her shoulders. He filed the injunction, she said, setting it down. Of course he did. He's asking a judge to freeze the center's assets while the federal case is pending. Says we're a risk to public trust. I blinked, heart pounding. If he gets it, we can't pay staff, can't fund programs, can't make payroll, she continued. Not until the hearing, which could be weeks, maybe longer. I picked up the document, reading the words as if they were in another language. It wasn't just an attack, it was strangulation. This is about control, I said softly. Morgan nodded. It always was. She paced while I read through the brief. Somewhere in the legalese and the baseless accusations, I saw it his last grasp at power. James hadn't been able to destroy the work, the people, or the community. So now, he was trying to choke off our ability to keep going, to freeze us in place. Like if he could hold the clock still, we'd lose our momentum. But what he didn't know, or maybe still didn't understand, was that momentum wasn't just money. It was people. And our people weren't going anywhere. By noon, we had a war room set up. Michael and the legal team worked through options. Dr. Walsh volunteered to speak publicly on behalf of the center's work. Lauren began prepping donors and allies for what might come, and quietly, without needing to be asked, Maria started organizing an emergency fundraiser. "We're going to do this the way we always do," she told me in the hallway, arms full of posters and paint supplies. Grassroots. From the ground up, I felt tears prick the back of my eyes. He's going to drag this out. "And we'll keep standing," she replied simply. That night, the atrium buzzed with activity. Volunteers strung up lights, artists set up pop-up exhibits, and former residents prepared baked goods to sell. The fundraiser wasn't just about money, it was about reminding ourselves that we were bigger than James's threats, that what he couldn't kill with lawsuits, he'd never control with fear. I walked through the rooms, greeting people, accepting hugs, listening to the quiet murmurs of solidarity. And when I stepped outside for air, I saw her, Jessica Martinez, the young surgical resident from Boston who'd first contacted me after my TED Talk. She smiled nervously. I wasn't sure if I should come, but Dr. Walsh said, "No," I said, pulling her into a hug. "I'm so glad you're here." She looked around the courtyard, eyes wide. "It's even more beautiful in person." "You came at just the right time," I said. "We need every voice right now." Jessica didn't hesitate. By the next morning, she was sitting beside Amy, working on our national advocacy plan for medical residency reform. Two women who had nearly lost everything to men like James, now building something that would outlast every lawsuit he could file. Still, the threat loomed. The hearing for the injunction was scheduled for the following Tuesday. We had less than a week to prove that freezing our funds would hurt more than it helped. The legal team filed motions, crafted arguments, gathered testimonials. But in my heart, I knew the truth. What would sway the court wouldn't be paperwork. It would be people. So we began collecting stories, real voices, from real women. Hundreds poured in. One from a mother whose daughter had taken her first steps in our daycare. One from a former resident now working as a nurse in Oregon, who said the center taught her what safety felt like for the first time. One from Sarah Mitchell, the resident James had pushed out years ago, who was now helping develop a program for physicians returning to medicine after trauma. Each voice built the case. Not for the court, but for the world. When the day of the hearing arrived, the courtroom was packed. Our lawyers sat beside me. Morgan, Dr. Walsh, Amy, Jessica, Maria, all lined the pews behind us. And in the back, women from all over the country sat shoulder to shoulder, silent but powerful in their presence. James wasn't there. His lawyers were. They argued risk. They cited blog posts and anonymous tips. They painted me as a manipulative figure, using trauma as a ladder. But then Michael stood, and when he finished, I stood too. I wasn't required to speak, but I asked the judge for permission. And when she nodded, I told the story, not of the soup, but of the aftermath, of what had grown, of who had risen. And when I finished, the courtroom was quiet enough to hear the clock ticking. The judge leaned forward. "Miss Shaw," she said, voice level, "your testimony reflects a great deal of integrity. But this is a legal matter. I must evaluate based on law." She paused, then smiled faintly. "But the law does not require me to be blind." The injunction was denied. When the gavel came down, the courtroom didn't erupt. It didn't need to. What we felt was deeper than applause. It was survival. And survival hard-won, painful, miraculous, was its own kind of victory. That evening, back at the center, I sat with Gran's old ledger in my lap, pages worn thin from years of flipping. It still smelled like rosewater and leather, like home. Outside, I could hear children laughing, a violin playing softly, someone humming in the kitchen. Life. James hadn't taken that from us. And he never would. The morning after the hearing felt different. Not lighter, exactly, but clearer. The air itself held a kind of quiet knowing, like the world had finally taken a deep breath after holding it far too long. I stood at the kitchen sink with my coffee, staring out at the garden. Gran's roses were beginning to fade with the season, but even in their wilting, they still looked proud, still held their shape. Morgan slipped into the kitchen without knocking, like she'd always belonged here. She carried 2 steaming cups and the kind of weary grin you only get after fighting a war and living to tell about it. "They tried to freeze us," she said, handing me the mug. "And instead, they just lit a fire. We didn't need to speak much. There was an understanding between us. Now that words would only slow, after months of enduring hit after hit, of watching James claw at every loose thread of my life, we'd come through the worst storm, and somehow, we were still standing. But peace, I knew, would never come easy. By noon, we'd already received a cryptic email. No name, no signature, just one line. "You should know he's not finished. Watch the foundation." Michael called it an empty threat. Probably nothing, but I knew better. James didn't operate on obvious plays anymore. His desperation had grown careful, patient, quiet. Morgan pulled the maintenance files for the center. Nothing looked out of place. Still, I called in a structural engineer just in case. That was the thing about abusers. They rarely struck the same way twice. That evening, the center held a survivor storytelling event. Dozens of women showed up, many for the first time. I sat near the back, content to listen. Their voices wove through the space like prayers, soft but unstoppable. Some cried, some laughed, some just spoke with the steely calm of someone who had lived through a fire and walked out whole. It was Jessica's words that stayed with me the longest. "I thought I was broken," she said, voice trembling, but sure. But I wasn't. I was bending, not breaking. And now I've snapped back. When the event ended, Maria found me near the art therapy studio, where a new mosaic had begun taking shape, this one all broken mirrors, shards of light catching in every angle. "We need to check the foundation," I said quietly. She nodded without asking why. "I'll meet you early tomorrow." The next morning, before the sun had even crested the horizon, we were walking the perimeter of the buildings. From the outside, everything looked fine. The brick was solid. The new atrium shimmered in the soft light, glass and steel warm against the morning chill. But Maria spotted it first. A small crack, low on the east wall, near the back of the carriage house. "Was that always there?" she asked, kneeling. I didn't answer, because I honestly didn't know. We photographed it, called the engineer again. By afternoon, the answer came. Not natural, sabotage. Someone had poured acid into the concrete base. Slow and controlled. The kind that wouldn't show signs of damage for weeks, maybe months, but would eventually compromise the structure. Not enough to bring the building down, the engineer said, but enough to cause serious problems, safety concerns, evacuation, permits pulled. It was a silent bomb, one designed not to make noise, but to sow doubt. "I want cameras on every corner," I told Morgan later that night. "Full security overhaul. No more trusting shadows." We brought in private security, upgraded our locks, had the structural team reinforce the foundation immediately. But James had made his point. He couldn't destroy us in court. So now he'd try to unravel us from underneath. And still we moved forward. The Boston General investigation had begun to bear fruit. Jessica's documentation, combined with Amy's support and Dr. Walsh's reputation, was triggering similar inquiries in other hospitals across the country. News stations started running segments. Medical journals requested interviews. One even ran a headline that made me laugh out loud. "The soup heard round the nation." I didn't want to be famous. I never had. But I did want the truth to live louder than the silence ever had. Morgan was coordinating outreach efforts now. Hospitals, universities, nonprofits. We were helping shape entire curriculums on abuse recognition and power dynamics in healthcare. "You realize this is bigger than the center now?" she said over lunch one afternoon. I nodded. It always was, but something was still gnawing at me. That anonymous email, the acid, the feeling I couldn't shake that James still had one more move left. It came later that week. Morgan burst into my office, pale and shaking. "You need to see this." She held out her tablet. I took it, expecting another article, another angry email, another gossip blog twisting facts. But it wasn't that. It was an arrest warrant. Not for James. For me. Charges of financial mismanagement, embezzlement of nonprofit funds, and fraud, Morgan said, breathless. Filed anonymously, but with just enough forged documents to look real. My heart dropped. "It's him," I whispered. "He's trying to make you the abuser." The weight of it settled like wet cement in my stomach. After everything, after fighting so hard, surviving so much, he was trying to swap our roles entirely. Make me the predator, make himself the victim. Michael arrived within the hour. We went into lockdown: legal, administrative, public relations. We knew the claims were false. But in a world addicted to scandal, sometimes innocence didn't matter. It was about noise, headlines. "Let him push," I told Morgan that night as we sat in the security room, watching camera feeds of our center at rest. "Let him scream and claw and lie." I touched the worn leather of Grant's ledger in my lap. He doesn't understand that everything he throws at us just gives us more truth to stand on. The walls of this place had heard too many stories to be undone by one man's lies. And the women who walked these halls, they were no longer afraid of shadows. By morning, the media storm had broken open like a summer thunderclap, loud, sudden, and unforgiving. Every major outlet in the Pacific Northwest ran the same headline, spun slightly differently. "Nonprofit founder under investigation for financial misconduct." Underneath, my photo. The one from last year's gala: hair neat, pearls on, mid-sentence. They chose it on purpose, I realized. The moment I looked most sure of myself. "They're trying to crucify you," Morgan muttered, slamming her laptop shut in the kitchen. "They're not even pretending to be balanced." Michael arrived minutes later with a stack of printed documents, his jaw tight. "Someone's planted a dozen falsified expense reports. The amounts are just low enough to look like carelessness instead of theft, but it's enough to warrant a formal audit." The room felt heavier with each word. "They're claiming you rerouted grant money to your personal design firm," he added quietly, "and that you used center funds to renovate your apartment above the carriage house." I nearly laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so desperate. That space had been donated and registered with the center from the start. Everything about it, receipts, contracts, permits, was documented. But James didn't need to win this round. He just needed it to linger long enough to cast doubt. "They're not playing for the verdict," I said. "They're playing for the smear." Michael nodded. "That's why we need to move faster than them." We activated every contact we had: pro bono accountants, PR experts, independent forensic auditors, the original grant foundations themselves. One by one, we gathered documentation, recorded sworn statements, built a digital fortress of truth. The facts were on our side, but the damage had already started to seep into the edges of our community. That evening, as I stood near the edge of the atrium watching a new group of survivors arrive for intake, I saw at hesitation. One woman, maybe mid-40s, clutching a worn duffel bag and holding her daughter's hand, paused before the front steps. Her eyes scanned the headlines displayed on her phone screen. I saw her whisper to the girl, starting to turn back. I walked out without thinking. "You're safe here," I said, meeting her eyes. She looked uncertain, then brave. "I read about the charges," she said quietly. "I know," I replied, "and I can't change how people spin the story. But what I can promise you is that this place, everything it stands for, was built to outlast that kind of noise." Her shoulders loosened just enough. She nodded, and she walked in. That moment steadied something in me. This wasn't just about me anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. James was playing chess with ghosts, trying to knock down a legacy built by hundreds of hands, not just mine. But it was Morgan who came to me late that night with a folder that changed everything. I pulled our donor contact logs, she said, and I noticed something strange. There's a name that shows up in our system last month tied to an anonymous tip line submission, but we never got a matching email or message. She handed me the file. The name hit like a cold wind. Catherine Shaw, my mother. I hadn't seen her name in years. Not since she walked away from Gran's funeral without a word. She's in the city, Morgan said, lowering her voice. I checked the address linked to the IP ping. East Side, a senior living complex. I sat in silence, staring at the printout. She used the center's name as a tag in a message to the Seattle Chronicle. But then she withdrew it. Old emotions surged: anger, confusion, that deep ache of abandonment. What did she say? I asked. Morgan hesitated, she said. She had information about how your grandmother acquired the properties. That not everything was as legal as it seemed. The room spun slightly. My throat went dry. That night, I barely slept. I hadn't seen my mother since the day she left me in Gran's care and disappeared into a string of second marriages and warmer climates. She never called, never wrote, but here she was, a ghost rising just as James launched his latest attack. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I drove out to the east side of the city, through streets that felt unfamiliar, brittle in the way forgotten parts of town always do. The senior complex was modest, quiet, with a central courtyard full of yellowing plants and metal benches warmed by the sun. She was sitting on one of those benches, hair gray now, but the same sharp eyes. She looked up when I stepped into the light and didn't flinch. I figured you'd come. I sat across from her. I don't have time for riddles, I said. Did you send that message? I did. Why? She stared at me for a long moment, then sighed. Because I made a mistake. A long time ago. And I thought maybe if I told the truth, I could clean it up before I'm gone. My heart pounded. What truth? She pulled a letter from her purse. Handwritten, yellowed with time. Your grandmother didn't technically buy the Victorian property through legal channels. Not at first, she said. It was a foreclosure. The owner abandoned it, and she took possession before it went back to the city. She did eventually clear the title, got signatures from community members. But the original transfer? It was a gray area. And someone, James, maybe got their hands on a copy of this. I unfolded the letter. It was from the original owner, written years after the fact, thanking Gran for saving the house, but acknowledging she'd taken it without formal process. It could be interpreted either way, heroic or opportunistic. If James spins this the right way, my mother said, he could cast doubt on the entire foundation of the center. I stared at her. Why are you helping him? She didn't look away. I'm not. I'm trying to undo what I did. He paid me to send that letter, said it would just help clarify history. I didn't know who he really was. But when I saw what he was doing to you, what you were building, I pulled back. I'm sorry. Sorry. It didn't change everything, but it was something. That evening, I met with Michael and Morgan. We have to get ahead of this, I said, before James leaks this himself. So we did. The next morning, I stood at a podium in the center's atrium and told the full truth about the letter, about Gran's actions, about how the building's original title was acquired through unconventional means but rectified within legal bounds. I held nothing back. This center, I said, wasn't built from perfection. It was built from intention, from women who did what they had to do to protect others when no one else would. If that legacy is flawed, then so be it. But it is ours, and it has saved lives. The crowd was silent. Then someone began to clap. Then another. Then the room. James had tried to use my past to destroy my future. But what he didn't understand was this. Truth isn't weakness. It's strength, sharpened by time. The next few days blurred into a steady rhythm of interviews, legal consultations, and late-night meetings. After my public statement, the headlines began to shift. No longer whispers of misconduct, now they were conversations about legacy, redemption, and the power of transparency. The world hadn't ended because I admitted something imperfect. It had opened, but James didn't back off. Instead, he pivoted. A new round of attacks began, this time subtler. Emails went out to grant foundations and donors, questioning whether the Vancouver Center was a wise investment. Anonymous letters arrived at board members' homes. Someone attempted to access our private server, and although our firewalls held, it was a clear escalation. "I feel like we're living in a John Grisham novel," Morgan muttered, staring at the latest email from a donor nervously requesting a phone call. "This is the endgame," Michael said, tapping his pen against the table. "He's exhausting every last tool in his arsenal. But there's a desperation to it now." And then something unexpected happened. An invitation arrived in my inbox. A medical conference. The keynote speaker? James. His topic? Resilience and leadership in crisis. Morgan snorted. The irony could break the sound barrier, but something in me shifted as I read the details. The event was public. Journalists would attend. Medical professionals, many of whom were still unsure which side of the fence they stood on. He wasn't just speaking. He was reclaiming the narrative, and I couldn't let him. "I want to go," I said, startling both of them. "You're not serious," Michael said. "It's bait." "Maybe," I said, "but if I stay away, he gets the last word. And this time, I want to hear it with my own ears. I want him to see what he couldn't destroy." The room fell quiet. Morgan nodded first. "Then we'll go together." We traveled as a team: Morgan, Dr. Walsh, and 2 other members of the center's leadership. I wore navy, no pearls this time. Just a small silver pin Gran once gave me in college. A single rose, carved into metal. The ballroom was massive, filled with round tables and glinting chandeliers. James took the stage right on time. He looked thinner. Not frail, but leaner, like the stress had carved away parts of him. And yet, the voice was the same. Smooth, measured, controlled. He spoke about adversity, about the toll of public life, about false accusations and character assassination in the digital age. He never said my name, but he didn't need to. Leadership, he concluded, isn't about avoiding mistakes. It's about how we carry ourselves when others try to define us by theirs. The applause was polite, then waned. Some people stood, some didn't, then the unexpected. A Q&A. A microphone was set up in the aisle. I didn't move right away, but Morgan looked at me. "If you don't say it now, you'll regret it." I stood. The walk felt long, too long. I reached the mic. James looked up, and his expression barely shifted, but I saw the flicker. He hadn't expected me. "My question," I said, voice steady, "is simple. When you speak of false accusations, does that include the audio recordings of your own voice? The financial records? The testimony of over a dozen women?" The silence was immediate and profound. James blinked. "This forum isn't, because if it does," I continued, "then I'd like to understand how you define falsehood." He stepped back from the podium, just slightly. "I won't be debating personal matters in public, but you'll profit off them," I said. "You'll build a brand on resilience while quietly hiring people to stalk, intimidate, and leak confidential records. Miss Shaw, Dr. Warner, is in the audience," I said, turning. "So is Dr. Chen Dr. Walsh. And 5 women from the Vancouver Center, whose stories your team tried to buy and bury. Shall we bring them up?" Murmurs spread through the crowd. People looked around. Cameras clicked. The moment hung heavy, then cracked wide open. James stepped back from the podium. "I think we're done here," he muttered. But the audience didn't follow him. They looked at me. I didn't say another word. I didn't need to. Outside the ballroom, reporters swarmed, but I didn't stop. I walked straight through, back to the car, and slid into the passenger seat next to Morgan. "That," she said breathlessly, "was one hell of a mic drop." It wasn't about retaliation anymore. It was about standing in truth, owning the scars, and refusing to let someone else speak louder than the reality I lived through. Back in Vancouver, something shifted. More women came forward, not just survivors, doctors, nurses, medical students. Jessica Martinez, the resident from Boston who'd first contacted us, sent a video update. Their hospital was now under formal investigation, with 6 whistleblowers protected. Under new policies, we helped draft. Amy, our resident advocate, had launched a mentorship initiative for young doctors navigating power imbalances. Maria, our art therapy director, opened her first satellite gallery in Portland, showcasing pieces created by survivors of professional abuse. Even Linda, one of our earliest residents, had secured funding to launch a financial literacy podcast aimed at women rebuilding from scratch. The center thrived. Construction began on our second location. Our trauma-informed design guide was published nationally. Grand's legacy pulsed in every beam, every story, every quiet, triumphant step forward. But James's conference moment wasn't forgotten. A week later, the medical board released their final decision on James's appeal to reinstate his license. Denied, permanently. The ruling cited not only past misconduct, but his ongoing pattern of evasion, manipulation, and retaliatory behavior. Morgan brought the letter to me in the atrium. She didn't speak, just handed it over. I read it in silence, then folded it in half. "He'll never practice again," I whispered. "No," she said. "And more importantly, he'll never control the narrative again." That night, I walked the garden path behind the center alone. Grand's roses were thick with late summer bloom. The scent clung to the warm air, earthy and sweet. I stopped near her favorite spot, a curved bench beneath the lilac tree. I sat and closed my eyes. "I did it, Gran," I murmured. And for the first time in a long time, the silence felt like peace. The days after the board's ruling passed in a kind of quiet triumph. We didn't throw a party. There were no speeches or toasts, but there was a sense of exhale that rippled through our halls. Staff walked a little lighter. Survivors attending workshops lingered longer in the gardens. Even the roses seemed to bloom fuller, brighter. Still, the work didn't stop. The center's second location was already ahead of schedule, and our new curriculum on power abuse in professional environments had been requested by 3 universities across the West Coast. It was the kind of momentum we'd only dreamed of 2 years ago. And yet, beneath that rising tide, something strange started happening. It began with a voicemail. I was in my office late one evening, reviewing design proposals for a new trauma-informed shelter wing in Spokane, when my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. The voice was raspy, older, male. "I don't know if you remember me, Miss Shaw," the man said, "but I think you should know. James isn't done, not by a long shot." Then he hung up. I stared at the screen for a moment, pulse kicking up. I replayed the message twice, but it was short. No identifying information, just that warning. I let Morgan listen to it the next morning. "He's bluffing," she said, though her brows were tight with concern. "It's probably one of James's old drinking buddies trying to rattle you. Maybe, but it didn't sound like a bluff." Then we dig. She activated our security team immediately. All staff were reminded to be cautious about emails, visitors, and information requests. Cameras were checked, access logs reviewed, but there were no signs of physical threats, just an unease settling into the air. It took 3 days for the next thing to happen. Dr. Walsh arrived at my office holding a thick envelope. She looked pale. "This came to the hospital," she said. "Marked confidential. No return address." Inside were copies of old medical files, heavily redacted, but the ones that weren't were damning. Not of James this time, but of a former board member of the Vancouver Center, a woman named Elise Monroe. It was a calculated strike. Elise had joined our board 6 months ago, retired pediatric nurse, tireless advocate, beloved in the community. The files showed a malpractice complaint from 20 years ago involving a missed diagnosis. The child had survived. The case was dismissed. But the way it was packaged now with annotations, circled phrases, and manipulative commentary, it was clear someone was trying to discredit her. Dr. Walsh exhaled. "They're trying to fracture us from the inside now." "Elise has been nothing but transparent," I said, heart pounding. "This is just old blood they're trying to stir up. Still, if it leaks, it won't. We control the narrative, not them." I called Elise myself. She answered on the second ring, already aware. "I wondered when you'd call," she said, voice calm. "They've contacted the local paper too. A man named Stanford. Said they were investigating a pattern in my old clinic. Stanford, James's lawyer. It hadn't ended, not really. He'd just taken the war underground. Do you want to step back from the board? I asked her gently. No, she said. This is exactly why I joined. If they want to use my past to scare me, they'll find out I've already made peace with it. I hung up with a renewed sense of clarity. This wasn't about damage control anymore. This was about resilience, endurance, quiet defiance. Still, the attacks continued. Someone made false complaints about our building's fire codes. Another anonymous letter accused Morgan of financial impropriety, laughable, considering she kept our books like a military ledger. But what broke my heart wasn't the malice. It was the fatigue. Our staff people who had fought so hard for this mission were tired, always bracing for the next hit, always watching their backs. It reminded me too much of how I used to live, under James's shadow, on edge, hyper-vigilant. That night, I walked through the center long after everyone had left. I passed the art therapy room, the business incubator, the quiet meditation garden, lit with soft golden path lights, and I realized something. James wasn't trying to win anymore. He was trying to wear us down, chip by chip, crack by crack, and I would not allow it. The next morning, I called a full staff assembly. Everyone, from therapists to janitors. We gathered in the main atrium, sunlight filtering through the glass ceiling. I stood at the front with Grant's rose pin on my collar, and I told them everything, not just about the attacks, but about the strategy behind them, the psychological warfare. They want us scattered, I said, worried, distracted, but this isn't the time to retreat. It's the time to link arms. I saw heads nodding, tears welling, even laughter in spots. So I handed the mic to others, to Elise, who shared her version of that long-ago malpractice case and what she learned from it, to Linda, who read from a letter she'd just received from a woman in Ohio starting her own survivor support group using our materials, to Amy, who updated us on new hospital reforms being piloted across 3 states, born from the very policies we drafted in our little office. By the time the last person spoke, the room had transformed. It wasn't a workplace anymore. It was a community, a movement. We ended with a spontaneous decision, something that felt more spiritual than strategic. We would plant a new garden, not just roses. This one would have herbs, wildflowers, vegetables. It would be tended by residents, volunteers, staff. We'd call it the Resilience Garden. Every season, it would grow something new. Every season, we would harvest hope. And just like that, James's campaign of attrition began to fail because he didn't understand that exhaustion doesn't break communities like ours. It tempers them, makes them sharp, focused. After all, we'd survived worse than him. We'd survived him, and we weren't going anywhere. The first seedlings for the Resilience Garden arrived on a misty Tuesday morning, delivered by a local nursery that had once refused to partner with us for fear of backlash. Now, they brought heirloom tomatoes, lavender, echinacea, and delicate trellises of climbing roses. The irony wasn't lost on me. What had once been our grandmother's legacy of silent shelter was becoming something rooted, fragrant, and visible. But even as volunteers planted thyme and basil in neat rows along the garden's edge, something else arrived. A letter. No return address. No postage stamp. Just my name printed in a tight, clean font. Inside, a photo. Grainy, black and white, clearly taken decades ago. A young girl standing on a cracked sidewalk in front of an old motel, her face turned toward a man in scrubs. The caption typed beneath it. She wasn't the first. There was no signature, no explanation, but I knew what it meant. I brought it to Morgan that afternoon. She took one look and swore under her breath. "This is a warning shot," she said. "Or a breadcrumb." Morgan glanced at me. "You thinking what I'm thinking? That this isn't about us anymore. It's about something much bigger, a pattern." We spread the photo out on my desk and began cross-referencing hospital staff records, incident reports, and community complaints from the past 30 years. By the end of the day, We had a list of 17 women patients, nurses, residents, who'd either disappeared quietly from the medical world or had filed complaints that were quickly buried, all connected in some way to James or his former colleagues. The story was widening. We weren't chasing justice for me anymore. We were chasing a legacy of silence, and we were going to break it. That night, I met Amy and Dr. Walsh at a small diner off the interstate. We needed privacy. What we were about to attempt wouldn't just rattle cages, it would rip the doors off of them. Amy slid a flash drive across the table. 3 more residents came forward, she said. One has documentation from back when she was a med student. Emails. Evaluations altered. One of them ended up institutionalized for 6 months because James convinced the school she was unstable. I felt my stomach drop. Dr. Walsh leaned in. It's not just the abuse. It's the machinery that protects it. The institutions, the donors, the old boys clubs. I nodded. It's time for a reckoning. And so we began to build the case. Not a legal case, not yet. That would come later. This was something else, a public truth. We gathered every story, every document, every photograph, every voice willing to be heard. We recorded testimony. We digitized old records. We verified timelines, tracked transfers, mapped connections. Within 3 weeks, we had what amounted to a dossier the size of a college dissertation. Morgan called it the pattern file. It's not just one man's misconduct, she said, flipping through the index. It's a culture, a lineage, a system of learned permission. We didn't rush it. We wanted it airtight. And when it was ready, we made one call to a journalist who'd once been suspended for trying to investigate a sexual harassment scandal at a major hospital. She'd been blacklisted for years, but now she was working with a small, fierce, investigative podcast out of Portland, the kind that made the establishment sweat. Her name was Lydia North. When I met Lydia in person, she was every bit the firebrand I'd imagined. Sharp-eyed, quick-witted, and unafraid to ask questions most people flinched from. This is explosive, she said, scanning our summary files. You're not just exposing a man, you're exposing a blueprint. Yes, I told her, and we want the world to see it. Then let's make sure they do. She spent the next month embedded with us interviewing survivors, staff, medical professionals, even Elise. She recorded Amy reading journal entries from her first year in the program. She sat through an entire financial literacy class with Linda just to understand the healing process from the inside out. And then the podcast launched. 3 episodes, released 1 week at a time, titled simply, The Pattern. The first episode told my story soup and, all but not in isolation, it was a jumping-off point. A single match dropped in a field of dry grass. The second episode revealed the historical layers, Dr. Warner's files. The residents who were buried, relocated, dismissed. The third episode was the bombshell. Amy's recordings, Elise's case, the institutional cover-ups, and names. Names that had been protected for years. The morning it dropped, the center's phone lines rang nonstop. Emails flooded our inbox, some hateful, most grateful. Hospitals scrambled to respond. Boards announced independent reviews. Medical schools issued statements about curriculum reform. James, predictably, issued a denial. His lawyer called it a witch hunt, but we'd expected that, planned for it. And then came the moment that caught us all off guard, a knock at the center's back door. I opened it to find a woman in her 60s, gray hair in a messy braid, eyes the color of stormy skies. She held up an old leather bag. I was the girl in the photo, she said, and I'm ready to talk. Her name was Bethany. She'd been 16 when she was treated by James's mentor. Not James himself, but someone whose name appeared more than once in our pattern file. Someone James had called a second father. She told us about the manipulation, the pain, the way she was dismissed when she spoke up. She'd left town, changed her name, built a quiet life working at a roadside bookstore in Montana, and she had kept journals, records, detailed ones, Morgan sat in stunned silence as Bethany read from one of them, hands trembling slightly. "That man taught James everything," she said. "Not just how to heal, but how to hide." We scanned and cataloged the entire bag of evidence. And as we worked late into the night, I glanced around the office at Morgan, Amy, Dr. Walsh, and Bethany, and I realized something I hadn't before. James's mistake wasn't just underestimating me. It was underestimating, all of us, the ones who wouldn't be silent anymore. Bethany stayed in the guest suite behind the center's greenhouse. She'd intended it as a short visit, maybe a few days to drop off her journals and tell her story. But as more women came forward in response to the pattern, something changed in her. "I thought I was done," she said one morning, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee as we sat beneath the pergola. "But I'm realizing now my silence wasn't protecting me. It was protecting them." So she stayed. She joined the art therapy sessions, sometimes sitting quietly with the others, sometimes guiding their hands through the early phases of clay molding. Turns out, Bethany had spent years sculpting in private, pieces she never sold, just forms, curves, faces, all drawn from memory. One sculpture stood out, a woman with her mouth covered, one eye open, the other blindfolded. We placed it at the entrance of the center's new intake wing. No plaque, no explanation. It didn't need one. The tide was turning, and we all felt it. Lydia's podcast had gone viral in a way none of us had anticipated. Cable news shows were quoting it. Talk radio debated it. Former residents from medical programs across the country wrote in to confirm what we already knew: the abuse wasn't isolated to James or his circle. It was systemic. One letter stood out. A woman in her 80s, a retired nurse from New Orleans, sent us a handwritten letter with a copy of her 1964 resignation slip. "I left because no one believed me," she wrote. "Listening to your story, I realized I've been carrying this weight for 59 years. Thank you for showing us it wasn't our fault." Morgan read it aloud in the staff meeting, her voice cracking slightly by the last line. And then came the subpoenas, not against us, against them. The state attorney general's office had opened a formal inquiry. Our files, thanks to the rigorous documentation Morgan and Dr. Walsh had insisted on from day one, formed the backbone of the investigation. James went quiet. For weeks, there was nothing. No statements, no appearances. Until one afternoon, an envelope arrived at the center, addressed to me in blocky, uneven handwriting. Inside, a photograph of the center from across the street, dated 2 nights prior, and a single note: "You've said enough." I brought it straight to security. "We need to increase monitoring around the perimeter," I told them. "Install another camera on the west side, and assign someone to stay overnight in the greenhouse suite." They nodded. No questions. They knew the stakes. That evening, I sat with Morgan in the administrative office, staring at the photo. "He's rattled," she said. "He's never been this quiet, and that's exactly why I'm nervous. Because men like James didn't disappear quietly. They waited, calculated, and when the right moment came, they struck." The next week, a group of center alumni hosted an open forum at the community center downtown. Survivors, advocates, doctors, teachers. Each stood and told their stories, not just of what they'd survived, but of what they'd built after. Bethany stood too. I was told my story was too old to matter, that the past was gone, and I should just be grateful I survived, she said, her voice steady. "But I've learned something here. Survival isn't the end. It's the beginning." Applause erupted. She barely blinked, just smiled and returned to her seat. Later, a young woman from the audience approached me. 20, maybe 22. She wore hospital scrubs under a long cardigan and kept glancing over her shoulder like she expected someone to stop her. "I don't know if I'm ready to speak publicly," she said, "but I have something." She handed me a flash drive, fingers trembling. "My attending physician. He's one of the names mentioned in the second podcast episode. I didn't realize it until I heard the exact phrase he used with me. You need to learn your place if you want to survive in this field." I nodded, taking the drive gently. "You did the right thing," I said. "You're not alone." After she left, I tucked the flash drive in the secure safe behind the main office. Another piece of the puzzle. Another voice added to the chorus. And then news broke. The hospital board, where James once held a seat, had voted unanimously to revoke all honorary titles and affiliations. His name was scrubbed from the teaching hall, photos removed from the alumni wall. A small thing, perhaps, but symbolically massive. The same day, Morgan found a post buried in a fringe medical forum. An anonymous user, claiming to be close to the situation, warned that James was planning something to take back control of the narrative. "He's going to try to flip this," she said. "Spin it like he's the scapegoat for a broken system. Then we beat him to it." I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I paced the garden, the soft sound of wind chimes and night crickets weaving around me. Bethany's sculpture glowed faintly under the motion sensor light. I sat beside it, fingers brushing the cold clay. Gran would have known what to say. She always had a way of grounding me in moments like this, of reminding me that truth doesn't shout, it stands firm. The next morning, we held a press conference, not to defend ourselves, not to retaliate, to declare the launch of a national coalition, the Haven Network, dedicated to exposing institutional abuse and supporting survivors in every major city. "We aren't just building shelters," I said into the microphone. "We're building systems of justice, communities of truth, and we will not be intimidated back into silence." As we left the podium, a reporter stopped me. "Do you expect retaliation?" I met her gaze squarely. "I expect it, but I don't fear it anymore. We were too far in to turn back. The network was growing. Our foundation was stronger than ever. But as we drove back to the center, I noticed something that made my pulse quicken. A car, black, parked across from the east entrance. Same make and model that had appeared in surveillance footage months ago. I didn't say anything to Morgan right away. Just noted the plate, took a photo, saved it to our shared drive. Back at the center, I climbed to the second-floor window of the intake wing and watched as the car pulled away, slow and deliberate. It was time to bring in more protection. Not out of fear, but out of responsibility. Because this wasn't just my fight anymore. The question I found myself asking, as the sunset painted the center in amber light, was this: when a man like James realizes he's lost control, what's the last thing he'll try to take back? And how far will he go to do it? The black sedan showed up again the next day, parked across from the community garden, engine off, windows tinted. It didn't move for hours. A couple of the volunteers noticed. One of them, a retired firefighter named Joe, who helped with our maintenance work, tapped me on the shoulder just before lunch. "You want me to walk over there? Take a look?" he asked, squinting toward the car. "No," I said. "Just take note of the plates. We've got someone monitoring footage now." I wanted to believe it was paranoia, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. James had gone too quiet, too still. And men like him only got quiet when they were planning something loud. That afternoon, Morgan tightened our security protocols again. Swipe access to every building, panic buttons in the therapy rooms, an armed guard stationed at night. It felt like we were gearing up for a storm, and not just a figurative one. I could feel it in the air, the electric tension that precedes something breaking. Still, we moved forward. The Haven Network's momentum was too powerful now to pause. Our announcement had made national news. 3 state governors had already reached out for consultations on integrating survivor protections into state healthcare policy. Dr. Walsh was flying to D.C. the next week to testify before a congressional subcommittee. The center buzzed with life and hope. Women arrived daily, not just for help, but to help. They ran workshops, built outreach programs, wrote grants, shared their stories in community centers and classrooms. And through it all, I kept one eye on that car. It came and went, never on a schedule, never with a driver visible, just a presence, a reminder. One morning I arrived early, before sunrise, to prep for a board meeting. The building was quiet, except for the cleaning staff, and a few early risers setting up the community cafe for breakfast. I went to the intake office, unlocked the door, and stopped cold. The window was cracked open, We never left that window open, not even an inch. I stepped inside slowly. The desk drawers were undisturbed, files still locked, but someone had been there. I could feel it like the cold before a fever. Morgan arrived 20 minutes later. I didn't say anything until we'd both finished our coffee. Then I showed her. She didn't ask how I knew, just nodded and picked up her phone. By noon, we had upgraded every window with sensors. Night staff increased to 2 guards, minimum. A local private security firm was hired to install a silent alarm system tied directly to the police. That night, I stayed late. I couldn't rest. Something in me, it wasn't fear exactly. It was readiness. Like a dog waiting for a whistle it couldn't hear, but knew was coming. At 1:42 a.m., the alarm went off. Not in the main building, in the greenhouse. The same greenhouse Bethany had been using for her solo sculpting work. The one with the guest suite tucked behind it. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my coat, grabbed my phone, and ran. The guards met me halfway across the property. "South door sensor," one of them said, breath short from running. It triggered twice, then went dark. We swept the building. No one. But the lock on the rear entrance had been jimmied. And in the dirt near the rose trellis, a shoe print, deep, male-sized, and fresh. Back in the office, I pulled up the surveillance feed. Morgan joined me 10 minutes later, face pale. The footage was clear. A man tall, broad-shouldered approached the greenhouse from the alley behind the center. Ball cap pulled low. Hoodie zipped to the neck. He paused at the rear door, glanced around, then used something thin and metallic to pop the lock. He was inside for exactly 7 minutes. When he left, he didn't take anything. That was what chilled me most. He wasn't looking for something, Morgan said quietly. He was sending a message. The next morning, the press caught wind of the incident. We didn't release details, just issued a statement. The Vancouver Center remains committed to our mission. Attempts to intimidate or disrupt that work only prove how necessary it is. But behind the scenes, I made a decision. It was time to go public, not just about James's abuse or the cover-ups or the investigations. That had been done. This was about power, about how far it would go to stay hidden, about how violence wore 1,000 faces, not just fists, not just files, but whispers, silence, shadows. So we started filming, not just a documentary, a statement. It would be raw, personal, no scripts, just stories mine, Bethany's, Amy's, Linda's, stories of how systems break women down, how control isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a quiet suggestion, a subtle threat, a closed door. We titled it, What Power Fears. By week's end, we had the trailer cut, a production team from LAAGREED to help us finish it pro bono. And we had a distribution deal lined up for PBS and streaming platforms by fall. James made his move 2 days later. He called a press conference. No, not in person. He wasn't that bold anymore. But his new lawyer, a silver-haired, media-savvy man with the moral compass of a crow, stood behind a podium outside a courthouse in Phoenix, flanked by 2 women in suits and pearls. They claimed they were former colleagues of James, claimed the charges against him were exaggerated, claimed that the Haven Network was orchestrated propaganda meant to demonize strong male leaders. They even produced a new expert witness, a disgraced former psychiatrist, who suggested I had a long history of emotional instability. Morgan watched the broadcast beside me, her arms crossed. Desperate, she muttered. They're throwing spaghetti at the wall. But people still eat spaghetti, I said quietly. We had to get ahead of it. That night, I recorded a message. Just me, no studio. Just my voice, my face, my story. I talked about the soup, the silence, the scar, and how every attempt to break me had instead broken the system that protected abusers. We released it on the center's YouTube channel. Within 48 hours, it had 1.6 million views. Former patients, residents, nurses, med students. Women from every walk of life flooded the comments, the inboxes, the donation forms. We believe you, we see you, we're with you. That was when I realized this wasn't about James anymore. Not really. It never had been. It was about the roots, the things buried deep, the rot that grew unseen. And it was about the women who finally had the tools to dig it out. Even as the storm gathered at our doors, even as the car returned, waiting, watching. Because what do you do when you've exposed the system, and the system is still watching you? By the time the dust settled from the hearing, I could feel something shift, not just in me, but in the people around me. We had been through fire together. And even though the legal battles weren't entirely over, even though James's claws still tried to drag me back through every headline, every whisper, every lawyer's letter, his grip was finally slipping. Morgan and I returned to the Vancouver Center that afternoon. The rain had stopped, but the ground still held the scent of wet pine and turned earth, like the aftermath of something violent yet cleansing. I stood under the glass-paneled atrium, watching light pour in from a gray sky, thinking about how much had changed since I'd walked out of Leclerc's that night, covered in scalding soup and shame. The first residents were already filtering into the new housing units. Women with quiet eyes and children who held their mothers' hands just a little too tightly. Some had black and blue memories. Others had fresh wounds on their cheeks or in their souls. Every one of them had been broken in some way, but none of them were beyond repair. Linda passed me in the hallway, clipboard in hand, and that no-nonsense stride she'd developed over months of healing. She was coordinating our financial literacy workshops now, helping women rebuild credit, set savings goals, and open their first checking accounts in years. She paused when she saw me. "You look like you've been through war," she said gently. I smiled. "We all have." She nodded, then added, "But you still got fight in you. I can see it in your eyes." It hit me then. This wasn't just about rebuilding anymore. It was about protecting, about expanding, about reaching further than James ever dreamed I could. And maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something even bigger. That night, I met with the board in what used to be Gran's dining room. The room still smelled faintly of old rosewood and lemon oil, like the Sunday dinners she used to host. I could almost see her at the head of the table, fingers laced, eyes sharp as she listened to every word, absorbing every detail. "We've had inquiries from 2 other states," Morgan began, her voice steady. "One from Michigan, another from North Carolina. Women's advocacy centers that want to partner or replicate the Vancouver model. They're asking for guidance, training, infrastructure." Patricia leaned forward. "They want the blueprint, and I say we give it to them." Rachel, our project coordinator, who had once fled her own silent hell, was already flipping through a proposal. "We'd need to scale slowly, select cities, a pilot program. But we can do this." My hand rested on the corner of Gran's old ledger, still preserved in the glass case in the corner of the room. That book had held the names of the first women Gran had quietly helped, the ones she'd sheltered before domestic violence. Shelters even existed in name. I thought about those women and the stories they'd never had the chance to tell. "We share everything," I said finally. "Every lesson, every mistake, every victory." Gran would have done the same. The motion passed without hesitation. The Vancouver Center would become the mother root of something larger, an ever-expanding network of support and recovery for women across the country. And we would lead it. But not everyone was ready to celebrate. Late that night, as I sat in my apartment above the carriage house, my phone buzzed with a familiar name, Amy. I answered, my voice soft. "I heard from someone on the hospital board," she said quickly. "James is stirring again. He's speaking at a conference next month. Private invite only, but the topic is physician rights and patient manipulation." My stomach twisted. "He's using his disgrace as a platform," she continued, "painting himself as a victim of false allegations. He's already gathering quiet support. It never ends. But this time, it didn't shake me. "We'll be ready," I told her. "Let him talk. We'll build louder." After the call, I stood at the window, watching the lights flicker across the city, each one a life still fighting in the dark. I knew the fight wasn't finished, not even close. James wasn't going to fade quietly into the background. Men like him never did. They found cracks in systems and slithered in, repackaging their abuse as misunderstood genius or moral panic. But we had something he never would, a community. And communities don't forget. That same week, Sarah Martinez, our PR lead, launched a national awareness campaign, Unbreakable Voices, Real Survivors. Real stories. Anonymous where needed. Bravely public where possible. Short videos, essays, podcast appearances. It wasn't about shock value or dragging names through the mud. It was about truth. About piercing the silence with human experience that no amount of gaslighting could erase. Linda's voice led the first video. She looked straight into the camera, her hand resting on a cracked porcelain soup bowl, glued back together with veins of gold leaf. Kintsugi, she explained, the Japanese art of repairing broken pottery with gold. They believe the breakage is part of the object's history, not something to hide. Her smile was soft. I am not ashamed of the cracks. I am proud of what I've become. Within 2 days, the video had over 200,000 views. We were starting to win the war of narrative, not by fighting, but by telling the truth with no apology. And somewhere in that, I started to feel something I hadn't felt since before Grant died. Hope. Maybe not for James. Maybe not for the ones who'd already lost too much. But for the next woman, the next daughter, the next version of me, standing at the edge of something awful and not knowing how to leave. We were building a road for her, and she was coming. The first few days after the board vote were a whirlwind press inquiries, requests for interviews, letters from women across the country who had watched from the sidelines, waiting for someone to stand up to men like James. Our announcement wasn't just news, it was a spark. Still, I knew better than to think James would go quietly. It happened on a Tuesday morning. I was in the center's counseling wing, reviewing progress notes with 2 of our therapists, when Morgan came running down the hall, phone in hand, face pale. She didn't say anything at first. She just handed me the screen. There it was, a new article published on a fringe medical integrity blog that had been quietly gaining traction among James's dwindling circle of allies. The headline screamed, "The Dark Truth Behind the Vancouver Center, Former Wife of Surgeon, Fabricated Abuse to Control Millions." Below it, a glossy photo of me from a charity gala a year ago smiling, perfectly coiffed, wrapped in pearls and confidence. A picture that James himself had once loved, used in his hospital's annual report. Now, it was weaponized. The article read like a manifesto, weaving conspiracy theories with carefully selected bits of truth, twisted just enough to be unrecognizable. It cited anonymous sources close to the former couple, painting me as unstable, manipulative, a woman who had cleverly built a false empire by destroying a good man's career. But what made my stomach turn wasn't the lies, it was the comments. Hundreds of them. Some sympathetic, but many cruel, filled with vitriol. They called me a gold digger, a narcissist. Some even threatened to protest outside the center. I sat down hard in the nearest chair. Morgan knelt beside me. We knew something like this was coming. He's trying to destroy you the only way he has left your credibility. And he's not even hiding behind legal threats now, I whispered. He's poisoning the public well. By noon, the story had spread. Local news stations began picking it up, reprinting excerpts and adding their own commentary. Our phones rang nonstop, some calls offering support, others demanding answers. A group of reporters gathered outside the gates. But the worst moment came that evening, just as I was about to leave for home. Maria, one of our newest residents, met me at the front door, tears in her eyes. "I saw the article," she said, voice trembling. "I know it's not true, but my ex found it. He sent it to my employer. Now I'm being asked to explain why I'm associated with the center at all." The realization hit me like a slap. James wasn't just coming for me, he was coming for the women we helped. Enough. The next morning, we held an emergency staff meeting in the atrium. Every chair was filled. Some faces were grim, others furious. "He wants to scare us," Lauren said flatly, "to isolate Rebecca, to make her a liability. But this center doesn't exist because she's perfect. It exists because she's human, because we all are. We need to respond," Morgan added. Not react, respond. Calmly, clearly. We show the truth. That afternoon, we recorded a video. Just me. sitting in the garden, soft light on my face, wind stirring the roses behind me. I didn't script it. I know what it feels like, I began, voice steady, to be called a liar, to have your truth questioned, your character picked apart, your intentions doubted by people who've never lived your life. But I also know what it means to survive. I told my story again, not just the soup or the trust or the courtroom battles. I talked about the women who came after, the systems we'd helped reform, the voices we'd amplified. I talked about my grandmother and the vision she passed down through blood and paper. I looked into the camera and said, "You don't have to believe me. Just listen to the women this place has helped. Listen to their stories, see the work, then decide." We uploaded it to our website and shared it with our network. Within hours, it was everywhere. But what none of us expected was what happened next. The women, the ones who had stayed silent, the ones James had once silenced, started speaking out. Not just about him, but about the broader culture that had enabled him for so long. One by one, nurses, residents, former hospital staff posted their stories on social media. A viral hashtag emerged, #WeBelievedHer. By the end of the week, we had over 1,000 new statements, many referencing James or men like him. The tide turned, but then came the subpoena. James had filed a civil suit, not against me, not this time, against the Vancouver Centre itself. He accused us of defamation, slander, emotional and reputational damages, claiming our work had triggered unwarranted harassment, career losses, and personal suffering. He demanded $10 million in damages. I sat in Michael Chen's office, the official letter trembling in my hand. "This is a new tactic," he said quietly. "If he can't destroy you personally, he'll try to burn down the thing you built." I looked at the ceiling, searching for clarity in the fluorescent glow. "Then he's going to have to walk through fire to do it." Michael leaned forward, eyes sharp. "Do you want to settle?" "No," I said. I felt the weight of every woman who had ever walked through our doors, of every whispered confession in a quiet room, every letter of thanks, every scar not hidden, every truth made visible. "No, we go to court." Now, as the legal fight loomed and our entire future hung in the balance, one question burned through everything. Was I ready to put it all on the line again, this time not just for myself, but for the hundreds of women who believed in what we built? And if I didn't, who would? The morning of our first legal hearing, the sky opened up in a cold spring rain that felt like a bad omen. I stood at the center's entrance, umbrella in hand, watching the vans from local news stations line up along the curb. The story had become bigger than us, bigger than me, even. What began as one woman's journey to survive had grown into a national conversation about abuse, power, and who gets to be believed. But the cost of telling the truth had always been high. I just hadn't realized how heavy it would feel walking into court not to defend myself, but to protect a sanctuary built for others. Michael met me at the courthouse steps. He looked calm, as always, the storm beating neatly on his tailored coat. "We've got everything we need," he said, quietly, handing me a folder. Documentation, witness lists, internal center audits clean as a whistle. But James has brought in a high-profile firm. He's coming to win this, not settle. I didn't flinch. I'd already settled once in my life, back when I married a man I thought would love and protect me. That mistake had taught me everything I needed to know about survival. Now I understood there is no peace in silence. We entered the courtroom, and I saw him for the first time in months. James. He sat at the plaintiff's table, flanked by two attorneys. His face was thinner, sharper, with a kind of brittle confidence that cracked the moment our eyes met. He looked away first. I'd once studied that face while he slept beside me. I knew every line, every small scar, but now I saw something I hadn't seen before, the emptiness beneath the polish. The man who'd once tried to scald me into submission had built his entire identity on being the hero. And now that the mask was slipping, all that was left was desperation. The proceedings began. James's lawyers painted a picture of a respected surgeon, wronged and ruined by a bitter ex-wife's campaign of lies. They framed the center as a financially motivated enterprise, suggesting our work was nothing more than a personal vendetta masked in philanthropy. I expected their cruelty. I didn't expect the disgust I felt when they projected a photo of James holding a child during a surgical mission trip. The image was meant to garner sympathy, but all I saw was manipulation, a weaponized past. Michael countered with grace and precision. He laid out our financials, showed the breadth of our partnerships, read statements from former patients and medical professionals alike who had experienced or witnessed abuse, some from James, others from within the very system that protected him. Then came the testimonies. Linda was the first to take the stand. She spoke softly but firmly, her eyes never leaving the jury. She described how James had approached her with hush money, how he tried to turn her pain into his defense. He said no one would believe me, she said, her voice steady. But when I walked through the doors of the Vancouver Center, someone finally did. Maria followed. She spoke about how the center gave her a space to rebuild her life and how the media smear campaign James initiated had nearly cost her a job opportunity. He's not just attacking Rebecca, she told the court. He's attacking all of us, every survivor who dares to speak. I was called last. As I stepped up to the witness stand, the room fell silent. My hands didn't shake. I looked at the jury, then the judge, then finally at James. He didn't look up. I didn't start the Vancouver Center to punish anyone, I began. I started it because I knew what it felt like to be hurt by someone the world saw as good, and because I knew I wasn't the only one. I described the night at Lidi Bistro, the soup, the silence that followed. And then I described what came after the flood of women, the buried complaints, the secrets hidden behind hospital walls. This isn't a personal vendetta, I said. It's a reckoning. I finished my testimony and stepped down, exhausted but unbroken. The trial continued for another week. James's lawyers tried everything, sowing doubt, cherry-picking financial statements, even accusing Dr. Walsh of professional jealousy. But the damage had been done, not by us, but by the truth. On the final day of arguments, the courtroom was packed. Reporters, survivors, former colleagues, people who had once whispered in fear, now stood tall in solidarity. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. They returned with a unanimous verdict. Not only was the Vancouver Center not liable for defamation, but James's lawsuit was deemed a strategic attempt to silence a whistleblower. The court awarded us damages enough to cover all legal expenses and fund new security measures for the center. James didn't stay to hear the ruling. He left the moment the verdict was read. His shoulders slumped, his mask shattered. I walked out of the courthouse into the waiting crowd, the sky still weeping a steady drizzle. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. But I didn't speak. Not yet. Instead, I turned to the women behind me, Maria, Linda, Morgan, Dr. Walsh, and so many others, and smiled. We had done more than win a lawsuit. We had proven that no matter how powerful an abuser may seem, the truth has a longer reach. Later that night, I sat alone in the center's garden, the rain now soft and silvery under the moonlight. The roses, Grand's roses, were starting to bud again, pink and fierce and unrelenting. I thought of everything it had taken to get here. The burns had faded. The noise was quieter now, but the mission was louder than ever. And still, I couldn't help but wonder, what would James do next? Would he fade away quietly? Or was there still another move left in the man who'd once tried to burn me into silence? The victory in court should have felt like closure. In many ways, it was. But closure isn't the same thing as peace. The media frenzy didn't die down immediately. For days, my face was everywhere on news segments, in online articles, even on talk shows where strangers dissected my choices like they were gossip fodder. Some celebrated the outcome, holding me up as a symbol of quiet strength. Others called me vindictive, said I'd ruined a good man's career over one emotional outburst. I tried not to read the comments. Most days, I succeeded. But at night, when the house was quiet and the workday was done, I still felt their weight, lurking just beneath my ribs. Morgan noticed. She always did. "You can breathe now," she said one morning as we walked the garden paths behind the center. "The worst is over." I smiled, but I didn't answer, because deep down, I wasn't so sure. James had lost the trial, but men like him didn't disappear. They regrouped, and the silence that followed felt more dangerous than any lawsuit or media campaign. A week after the verdict, I got the call. Dr. Walsh was on the other end, her voice taut. James filed a petition to reinstate his license. He's claiming the trial was politically motivated and the ruling should be inadmissible. I stopped in the middle of the walkway, gravel crunching under my boots. "He's going through back channels," she continued. "There's a new panel at the medical board, more conservative, more sympathetic to his story. If they reopen the review, he might get a hearing." I closed my eyes, the chill of spring air brushing against my cheeks. It felt like déjà vu. He's trying to claw his way back in. Dr. Walsh didn't sugarcoat it. And if he does, we're going to have to start all over again. The fatigue hit me harder than I expected, not because I was afraid of James winning, but because I was tired. Tired of fighting the same man in different forms. Tired of defending what should have been self-evident. That abusers didn't get redemption just because they wore a white coat. That survivors didn't need to be perfect to be believed. But rest wasn't an option. Not when women were still writing to us every week, asking for help, for safety, for someone to say, "I believe you," and mean it. So we regrouped. Again. Morgan mobilized the PR team to prepare a public statement in case James's reinstatement hearing moved forward. Dr. Walsh began contacting allies on the medical board, quietly lobbying against the petition, and I reached out to Amy. She'd been quiet since the trial, working long hours in her new hospital placement in Oregon. But when I told her about James's petition, her voice sharpened. "He can't be allowed back," she said. "I'll testify again. I don't care what it costs." It didn't surprise me. Amy had changed since that night in my office when she first told her story. She was no longer the uncertain resident afraid of her own instincts. She was confident now, steady, and angry in a way that no longer rattled her. It focused her. "I'll talk to the others," she added. "Some of the former residents are already organizing. By the end of the week, we had a coalition. 22 former medical students and residents, all willing to go on record again if James tried to return. Some of them had left medicine entirely because of what they endured. Others had stayed and fought their own battles, becoming advocates, mentors, teachers. None of them were willing to let James walk back into the operating room unchallenged. The ripple effect was already moving faster than we'd expected. Hospital networks in other states began requesting our reform protocols. One even invited Dr. Walsh to help draft a national training module on recognizing abuse of power in medical leadership. Still, the reinstatement hearing loomed like a dark cloud. And then, something unexpected happened. James's first wife, yes, the same woman who'd stood beside me during the press conference, reached out again. Her name was Diane. "I want to make a formal statement to the board," she said. "I should have done it years ago." We met at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town. She wore no makeup, her hair pulled back into a simple bun. There was something raw and resolute in her eyes. "I used to think silence was strength," she told me over black coffee. "That if I kept my head down, no one could hurt me again." But I was wrong. Silence just gave him more space to keep going. She had a story to tell, years of gaslighting, emotional manipulation, even subtle threats masked as concern. James hadn't started with me. I was just the next in a long line. Diane's affidavit became the cornerstone of our response to the reinstatement petition. We compiled everything: new testimonies, timeline evidence, even internal correspondence we hadn't used in the trial. Our legal team submitted a rebuttal so thorough the board had no choice but to delay the hearing. In the meantime, we did what we always did. We kept building. The second Vancouver Center location opened in Denver, housed in a converted Catholic school building. Survivors there began crafting their own programs, tailored to the needs of rural and underserved communities. The Art Therapy Collective grew. So did the Trauma-Informed Business Incubator. We were scaling the impossible and somehow thriving. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the old Victorian roofline, I stood in Grand's garden watching a new mother hold her baby under the arbor of climbing roses. She'd come to us 4 months earlier, bruised and shaken and barely able to speak. Now she was smiling, her baby cooing in her arms. It hit me then what this place really was. Not just a refuge, not even just a movement. It was a place where broken pieces came back together, sometimes stronger than before. James might still be lurking, waiting for a way back into his old world, but the world had changed, and so had I. For the first time in a long while, I believed he wouldn't win this time, not because he wouldn't try, but because too many of us had stopped being afraid. The next day, I received an email from the medical board. The hearing had been postponed indefinitely, and James? He was being investigated for additional misconduct in another state. We didn't celebrate, not really. We'd learned the hard way that men like him rarely go quietly, but there was a kind of satisfaction in knowing that this time, the shadows weren't his alone. We were watching now, and we weren't going anywhere. The seasons had begun to turn again, this time more gently. Spring gave way to summer, and the roses in Grand's garden bloomed a little fuller, as if they, too, had survived their own winter of silence and fear. Everything at the Vancouver Centre pulsed with life. Art classes spilled out into the courtyard. The hum of construction from our expanding East Wing echoed in the background, and laughter from the daycare rose up like music. But even with all that progress, I couldn't stop thinking about Boston. Jessica Martinez, the young resident who'd first reached out after seeing our TED Talk, had been working with our advocacy team for months. She and a small group of other residents had spent every spare moment documenting their experiences with a senior cardiac surgeon at Boston General. The pattern was all too familiar: verbal degradation masked as tough mentorship, professional sabotage disguised as constructive criticism, and private meetings that left young women in tears and silence. Jessica's voice was steadier now. She'd changed in the same way Amy had strength forged by fire. But the toll was obvious. In our video meetings, the dark circles beneath her eyes had deepened, and the hopeful glint she once carried now flickered more than it shone. "He's starting to retaliate," she said during our latest check-in, her tone clipped but resolute. "They've moved one of our group to a non-surgical rotation without explanation. The others are getting flagged in their evaluations. And me? I got called unprofessional for questioning his methods in rounds." I leaned back in my chair, pressing a hand over my heart. It was the same playbook, and it made my blood run cold. "We're compiling everything," Jessica added. "But it would help if we had national eyes on it before he can bury it." So we gave them just that. Our communications director, Sarah Martinez, worked overnight with a network of journalists and advocacy organizations to prepare a coordinated media release. By the end of the week, major outlets were covering the story: Boston's best cardiac surgeon accused of abuse by female residents. It wasn't just clickbait anymore. It was evidence-backed, deeply reported, and painful in its clarity. The Vancouver Centre released a formal statement of support, standing beside Jessica and her peers. We offered legal assistance, media protection, and, more importantly, a safe place for them to land if their program retaliated. That Sunday, as the headlines trended and the hospital's board scrambled to respond, Jessica called me, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm still scared," she said, "but not the same way. Not like before. Now I know I'm not crazy." "You were never crazy," I told her gently. "You were just alone. And now, you're not." That evening, I sat in Grand's old library, flipping through one of her ledgers. The pages were fragile with time, but the ink was bold names of women she'd helped, addresses of safe houses, coded notes about medical needs and job placements. She'd been building something long before I ever realized it, and now it was bigger than I could have imagined. We had 6 Vancouver centers in development. 3 were opening before year's end in Street, Louis, Portland, and a rural area outside Atlanta. Each one adapted the model to local needs, bilingual counselors in Texas, indigenous-focused programming in the Pacific Northwest, and mobile outreach for women in remote communities. But growth wasn't just about geography. It was about the soul of the thing. The philosophy we had built that recovery was more than survival. That healing required creativity, dignity, and purpose was catching fire in the best way. Schools were asking for our curriculum. Women's prisons wanted to adopt our programs. Even churches once hesitant to confront domestic abuse had begun reaching out for guidance. And amid it all, James stayed gone. No new lawsuits, no surprise media appearances, no further petitions. The silence wasn't comforting, but it was enough to breathe. For now, one night, Morgan and I sat on the porch of my apartment above the carriage house, a glass of sweet wine in each of our hands. The garden below shimmered in the moonlight. "He never apologized," she said quietly. I knew who she meant. "No," I replied, "and he never will." She took a sip, eyes scanning the stars. "Do you need him to?" I thought about that, about the soup, the burned scars now almost invisible, the nights I'd cried on that kitchen floor, about every lie he told, every look that made me question my sanity, every time I'd felt too small to fight back. "No," I said finally, "because he didn't build any of this. We did. And that's the part that lasts." She nodded, brushing a lock of gray hair behind her ear. "Then, I guess we keep building." And so we did. The next week, Maria's art therapy exhibit opened to the public. It was titled, "After the Fire." The centerpiece was a sculpture of a broken ceramic bowl, mended with gold, the Japanese art of kintsugi. Beside it stood a quote etched into glass: "What tries to destroy us may only reveal where we are strongest." People came from across the state to walk through the gallery, to cry and laugh, and whisper to the pieces on the wall. Survivors recognized themselves. So did their daughters. I lingered near the sculpture, watching a woman in her 70s place her hand gently against the glass. "That was me once," she whispered. "I just didn't know it until now." That's when I knew. What we were building wasn't just a center, or a movement, or even a legacy. It was a mirror one held up to every woman who'd been told she was too much, or not enough, or impossible to believe. We were giving them a place to see themselves clearly, and maybe, just maybe, for the first time, to love what they saw. The sky was painted in soft apricot and lavender as the sun dipped behind the ridge, casting long shadows across the Vancouver Centre's courtyard. The scent of blooming roses drifted through the air, familiar and grounding. We were preparing for something we hadn't dared name until recently, our 5-year anniversary. 5 years since the soup. Since James's hand had released that steaming bowl with a flick of contempt, aiming not just to hurt me, but to erase me. 5 years since my world cracked open like fine china, revealing both the fracture and the fire inside. And 5 years since the moment I began to rebuild differently, deliberately. Morgan stood at the far end of the courtyard, clipboard in hand, wrangling logistics with the quiet command she'd perfected over the years. A few yards away, Maria was showing 2 new residents how to wrap delicate wires for the sculpture they were installing in the atrium, and Sarah Martinez was on her phone near the entrance, coordinating press attendance. This anniversary wasn't just a celebration, it was a declaration. Inside the main house, the grand parlor had been transformed into a gallery of transformation. One wall held a photographic timeline of the Vancouver Centre's birth and evolution, framed by newspaper clippings and letters from survivors. Another featured the original architectural sketches Sophia's designs, reworked over time with input from trauma specialists and survivors alike. Near the fireplace, we'd installed a tribute to Gran. Her ledger lay open beneath a glass case, surrounded by artifacts from her hidden mission: a pair of gardening gloves, a stack of handwritten letters, a faded photograph of women standing arm in arm in front of the old Victorian mansion. It felt like she was there with us, watching as the seeds she planted continued to bloom. But what moved me most was the new art installation near the library. Maria had worked with dozens of survivors to create a spiraling wall of broken glass, carefully arranged to catch light and color. Each shard was etched with a word: strength, shame, rage, hope, silence, voice, fear, joy. At the center was a mirror. We'd titled it Reflections. It was everything this place stood for. As the guests arrived, donors, community partners, medical professionals, survivors, and their families, I saw familiar faces and newer ones, all woven into the same tapestry. Amy came in with a group of residents from Seattle General, now part of a task force rewriting hospital policies. Linda stood beside a display showcasing our financial literacy curriculum, beaming like she'd built the entire thing herself. And she nearly had. Even Rachel, our trauma-informed project manager, brought her 2 teenage daughters, who now ran peer support groups at their high school. The speeches began just as the sky deepened into indigo. Sarah welcomed everyone, then introduced me with a warmth that still made my knees weak. I stepped onto the small stage, beneath strings of soft lights. The crowd quieted, the rustle of folding chairs and murmurs giving way to stillness. "When this began," I said, voice steady, "it wasn't with a mission statement or a vision board. It began with a bowl of soup, one moment of violence, one man's attempt to assert control." A ripple went through the crowd. Those who knew nodded, those who didn't leaned forward. He meant to hurt me that night, to humiliate me. But what he really did was start a fire. I glanced around at the glowing windows, the voices rising in laughter from the atrium, the children playing in the daycare wing. Tonight, we don't just honor what we've built. We honor the women who refused to stay silent. We honor the legacy of those who came before us, and the courage of those just beginning. Because this place, this community, was never about revenge. It's about rewriting the story. The applause started softly, then grew until it filled the courtyard like a heartbeat. After the formalities, people lingered. Old friends embraced. New residents stood in quiet awe, absorbing the scope of what they were now part of. We served cake in the community cafe and shared stories over candles flickering in mason jars. And just when I thought the night couldn't hold more grace, something happened I hadn't prepared for. Jessica Martinez arrived. She'd flown in from Boston that morning, her residency behind her now. She wore a soft blue dress, her hair pinned back simply, but her eyes, those carried weight and victory in equal measure. "I wanted to see it for myself," she said, hugging me. What it looked like to win. We walked the garden path together, the stones warm beneath our feet. She paused in front of Gran's favorite rose bush and let her hand trail the petals. "You know," she said, "we started our own support group at Boston General. 3 of us. Now we're 12. And the hospital just brought in an outside investigator." She smiled. "They're finally listening." I didn't need to say a word. I just squeezed her hand and nodded. Later, as the evening wound down and people drifted home, I lingered at the edge of the garden. The wind carried the scent of honeysuckle and soil, of growth, of resilience. I thought of James. Not with hatred, not even with pity, just distance. He'd faded into the background now. I heard rumors he was teaching private courses in Arizona, but the medical board had made their decision. The man who once wielded surgical precision as both talent and weapon no longer had the stage he'd abused. His threats had lost their echo. His power had withered not in one grand gesture, but piece by piece eroded by truth, by persistence, by women refusing to be small. The story didn't belong to him anymore. As I stepped back into the mansion, the lights casting gold across the floorboards, I felt something I hadn't in years. Not just peace, purpose. Tomorrow, we'd start planning the next center. The calls from Chicago and Santa Fe were growing more urgent. The need hadn't gone away. But tonight, in this house built on pain and perseverance, we celebrated what we had become. Not victims, not survivors, builders. And the question I couldn't shake, as I watched the mirror at the center of the sculpture catch a glint of starlight, was this: if every broken piece carries its own light, how many more stories are waiting to shine? The morning after the anniversary celebration arrived with a kind of hush, the kind that follows the final note of a beautiful song. The Vancouver Centre stood quiet in the early light, the air scented with dew and roses. I walked the halls barefoot, the wood cool beneath my feet, letting the silence soak in. It wasn't an ending, it never had been, but it felt like a pause, a breath, a moment of reflection. My office windows faced the garden. Grand's roses were just beginning to bloom in full force, defiant against the lingering chill of spring. I opened the window to let the breeze in and saw a young woman sitting alone on the stone bench beneath the arbor. She held a sketch pad in her lap and stared at it as if the page dared her to speak. Her name was Emily, 24. She'd arrived 2 weeks ago from Des Moines after escaping an abusive relationship with a local politician. Her story had bruises, yes, but deeper wounds too. Gaslighting, threats, years of being told she was too emotional, too naive, too fragile to survive without him. She'd told me during intake that she didn't believe in programs, but she believed in the center. That morning she looked up and caught me watching. I smiled. She didn't smile back, not yet, but she gave the smallest nod acknowledgement, maybe even trust. A seed. Morgan found me a few minutes later, steaming coffee in one hand and a proposal folder in the other. "We've had 5 new inquiries since midnight," she said. 2 from Nevada, 1 from Oklahoma, 1 from Kentucky, all asking for help building something like this. She dropped the folder onto my desk. "You ready?" I took the folder in hand, opened it. A blueprint for expansion. Not just physical buildings, but partnerships, mentorships, training programs. The Vancouver model soon to be a national framework for trauma-informed community centers. "Let's do it," I said, the words landing with a calm certainty. That afternoon, Dr. Walsh called from D.C. She was testifying before Congress the next day, using our research and documentation to propose federal legislation requiring abuse prevention education in all medical institutions receiving government funding. "We're going to change the system," she said. "Not just patch holes, tear it down and build it better." Her voice shook slightly. The cost of years of fighting still weighed on her, even now. "You already are," I said. "We all are." Later, I returned to the sculpture in the atrium, the spiraled wall of broken glass and words. I ran my fingers along a shard, etched with shame, and another that said worth. My reflection stared back at me from the mirror at the center, older, stronger, softer too. What Gran had started all those decades ago, the quiet rebellion, the shelter behind the garden, the small acts of resistance had become a movement, a legacy, a new blueprint for what community and safety could look like. I remembered something she once told me, years before all this began, as we sipped sweet tea on her porch. "Little bird," she'd said, "when a fire comes, you either let it consume you or you let it clear the ground for something new to grow." I hadn't understood her then. Now I did. In the following weeks, we signed the lease on a building in Chicago. The Midwest needed us. Calls came in from social workers, ER nurses, law students. A former prosecutor from Texas offered to volunteer as our legal director. A trauma therapist in Atlanta asked to replicate our art therapy model. People wanted to believe in something real, something that didn't just treat wounds but transformed them. James, on the other hand, had all but disappeared. His last desperate lawsuit had been dismissed with prejudice. His name rarely came up anymore, except in training seminars mentioned not as a man, but as a case study, a cautionary tale of unchecked power and the cost of silence. The soup incident, once a humiliating memory, had evolved into a symbol of everything we'd reclaimed. We kept one of the shattered bowls in a display case at the center, not to glorify the past, but to remember what started it all and what it could never undo. That summer, I stood once again in the garden under the archway of climbing roses. Children's laughter echoed from the daycare, and wind chimes whispered near the porch. Morgan approached, holding a letter in her hand. "It's from Boston," she said, handing it to me. "Jessica's team launched their first standalone center. They're calling it the Shaw House." I blinked back tears, the kind that come when you realize something you started has grown bigger than your own hands. That evening, I hosted a quiet dinner with the women who'd stood beside me from the beginning. Morgan, Maria, Dr. Walsh, Linda. Even Sophia had flown in from Toronto. We sat in the carriage house studio, sharing stories, laughter, reflections. We didn't talk much about James anymore. He was no longer the shadow we were fighting. The mission had long outgrown him. We were building for the Emilys, the Jessicas, the ones still walking toward the mirror, still learning to say, "This is my voice." As the sky turned dark and the stars began to appear above the rooftops, I stepped out onto the porch and looked over the campus we'd built. The lights were on in the counseling rooms. A poetry group gathered in the library. A line of women walked from the main building to the cafe, arms linked. We were never just healing ourselves. We were reshaping the world for every woman who ever thought she was alone, for every survivor who thought she'd never find her way back, for every voice silenced in shame. This was for you. And as the garden bloomed under moonlight, soft and defiant, I asked myself, what might you build from the pieces meant to break you? You know, after all these years, sitting across from broken hearts and shattered spirits, I've learned something that stayed with me through every story, every scar, every tear-filled silence. Pain doesn't just leave a mark, it carves a path. This story, it's not just about betrayal or the cruelty of a man who mistook control for love. It's about what rises in the aftermath. It's about a woman who stood inside her own ruins and said, "No more." And then, she built something sacred. Real strength isn't loud. It doesn't throw fists or demand obedience. It shows up in quiet decisions, in choosing to stay or to finally walk away. It blooms in the garden of survivors who learn to trust again, love again, rebuild with the broken pieces. Sometimes, the moment that was meant to silence you becomes the spark that lights the way for others too. So if you're sitting in the dark right now, wondering how you'll ever find your way back, remember this. The ashes you're standing in, they can grow something beautiful. You are not broken beyond repair. You are the start of something powerful. And darling, maybe, just maybe, this is where your story begins.